G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and before the episode begins, I would like to give Native a huge shout out for sponsoring this video. Native is a great company that provides safe, simple, effective products that people use in the bathroom daily. Their products are formulated without aluminium, parabens, and talc, and instead are filled with ingredients found in nature. Native have been super generous and allowed me to try some of their products, and I've been using them for some time now. And their stuff has been reliably fantastic since day one. I recently ordered a bunch of their stuff in fact, and the service for delivery was great. I've been using the citrus and the herbal musk deodorant, and the smell is always just super fragrant. A little bit more subtle than the eucalyptus and the mint, but still fantastic. And what I noticed about this one too is that, just like the eucalyptus, it lasted on body and also in product really nicely. I'm a pretty busy guy and I work out a bit too, and the deodorant that I received and the stuff that I've ordered through them honestly has never let me down, and it's always kept me smelling really fresh. And although Native is priced at a slight premium compared to conventional deodorants, it's really safe and effective. The selection is really big, and along with some great reviews from customers, there's something for everyone on their website. Some of the scents that they have are coconut and vanilla, lavender and rose, and my favourite, the eucalyptus one. Must be the Aussie in me, right? They also have free shipping and returns, and even offer a complimentary unscented formula and baking soda free formula for people with sensitivities. So, for 20% off your first purchase, visit nativedeodorant.com and use the promo code SCARED during the checkout. That's 20% off your first purchase at nativedeodorant.com and use the promo code SCARED at the checkout. I hope you guys take up Native on their generous offer, and without further ado, let's begin. I come from a big country family, and we live on a farm. We raise our own food and meat animals, and we hunt and process and whatnot. My dad's first cousin is even a licensed taxidermist, so we get a lot of hunting in. For a bit of backstory, on the homestead that I grew up on, and still live on, it was my parents, my pop's first cousin and his wife, me and my 4 sisters, and my 4 female second cousins. So 4 adults and 9 kids, with lucky me being the only boy. And sometimes my pop's brother comes to stay with us too, especially when hunting season is starting up. So hunting season, deer, is going on, and my pops, his brother, Uncle K, and the cousin that we live with, Uncle V, are all getting ready to go hunting. Some of us kids decide to tag along, me 12 and my sister S 15, and my cousin A 14. We get permission from one of my Uncle K's friends to hunt his land a ways away, basically several hundred acres of forest. An important fact too is that, during the time that we were setting up, my pops and uncles were being quiet, while the 3 of us kids were talking. But my voice hasn't changed, and this is important. So us kids keep chattering away, while the adults are just letting us get our energy out while they check the survival equipment, making sure the guns are clean and working and all that. The strong silent southern types, you know. And all of a sudden there's a rustling in the thick brush around us. And suddenly, 3 creepy looking guys enter the clearing. They stop dead. One of them has a hand on his knife on his belt. They're clearly drunk as hell, and they keep looking between A and S and my pops and uncles like they're debating something. My pops and uncles stand up. Last bit of backstory too. Every dude in my family is huge. I'm 19 now, and I'm 6'5". My dad is the biggest of 6'10", 280. Just deeply intimidating, and so are my uncles V and K. The guys laugh nervously as my Uncle V picks up one of the rifles and points it at them. These dudes start running out of the clearing like the devil was after them, and my pops immediately says that we're clearing out. My uncles don't even question it, and neither do us kids. We're freaking out and totally take things down sloppy, but my pops doesn't say anything about us messing up his camping equipment. We get back into cell service, and my dad calls the cops about seeing those guys, but the cops just don't seem to think that it's serious since nothing happened. We also told the owner of the land, who took it more seriously as he had kids of his own, but we never heard anything about them appearing again on his land, to his knowledge. It's at that moment, though, that I realized A, S, and me, with my unchanged voice, were the only ones these guys could hear talking, and they obviously thought that they'd come across a camp of 3 girls by themselves. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always like camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail that I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped into my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to put my tent up. I stumbled upon this nice-sized clearing and decided that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm pretty exhausted at this point, but set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and managed to get a fire going. I roast some food and I start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer with a lame leg or something, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking or dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it and put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that, and I just go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent, and insert myself into my sleeping bag, and I decide that even at my exhausted and relaxed state, that I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book that I brought with me and I start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by, and then I hear that sound again, and this time it was closer. In fact, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and I listen to this animal walk or drag across the clearing towards my tent. It's really loud at this point, and it sounds like the hooves are all being heavily planted with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along. It makes it about what I assume is the middle of the clearing, and stops, and then I hear nothing. No breathing, and not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness, and I'm like, what the hell? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and just sit there listening for any other noises. Nothing, just the crickets and the breeze. I decide that there's a lot of strange noises in the woods, and I try not to let it bother me. Besides, I had my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, then women's laughter and stick snapping far off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing, or just a product of being half asleep or something. I hear more faint laughing from a couple of other different directions, all different, i.e. old men, old women, even some children, and confirm that it is indeed real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire a warning shot off in the air in case they came too close. There's something about this laughter, though, how far in I was, and the noise earlier, and the time of night told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was just dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided at this point that enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line and saw nothing. I listened intensely to my surroundings. No laughing, and the forest sounds had returned. So relaxing just a bit and figuring that I must have scared whoever off, I sat down in my exhausted state and eventually I fell asleep. I wake up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. And then I immediately hear 2 people whispering not too far from my tent. Alert, I grab my rifle and I listen to what they're saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" And the voices, they fall silent. I shout again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" when suddenly a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people just standing around it. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and then it just goes completely dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and I sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was, and I just hiked until sunrise back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. Strangely, I never heard anyone follow me, and I never saw anyone or anything the whole way. But I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that, too, my enjoyment of camping alone left me, just like I left all my gear in the woods that night. This happened in my first year at uni, Australia. I was moving out of home for the first time, and I think this made me very, very naive in this situation, at 20 and female. So I found a cheap place in the city near my workplace or uni at the time, $150 per week for a room in the storehouse, only 20 minutes out from the CBD. It seemed like an awesome deal to me, and my message to the landlord and told her that I was interested. Before she gave me time to come and inspect the place, she seemed overly interested in my ethnic background. I'm half Ethiopian, so I definitely don't look white, but when I told her that I'm Australian, she suddenly became kind of withdrawn. I thought it was strange. I mean, maybe she thought that I was lying because she had seen my profile photo on flatmates.com, so I explained my background. She seemed satisfied with my answer, and so we organised a time for me to come and see the room. So Denise showed me around and talked as if the place was already mine, which I thought was exciting. There was a main house with 5 bedrooms, a caravan on the side, and a granny flat behind it with 3 bedrooms, which is where I would be moving in. The main house and the caravan were full, 7 people living there, but only one of the rooms in the granny flat was actually occupied. It was nice enough considering, and very clean. A weekly cleaner was included in the rent price, as well as weekly maintenance. I didn't think to ask what that meant because I was already pretty set on moving in. But I met the people who would go on to be my housemates. All of them were foreigners, mostly Chinese or South Korean, who had come to study. I still didn't find this odd. I mean, there are plenty of international students here. The door to my room had a lock on it, and I was told only myself and Denise had a key, but Denise never usually came to the house, so there was a nice level of privacy. So a week after I moved in, I met the maintenance guy, Patrick. He seemed to be gardening and came over to introduce himself. Seemed nice enough, and I found out that he's Denise's brother. He looked to be out in his late 40s or so, and I found him to be a little bit awkward, but I've been raised to be polite to a fault, so I ended up talking to him for a long time before going back to my room. I don't remember what we talked about, but I remember he kept saying things like I was very beautiful and describing my skin as exotic and caramel more than once, which kind of rubbed me the wrong way if I'm being honest. A few days later, the cleaner comes also. She's super lovely and has known Denise and Patrick for a long time. She and I had nice chats, and for some reason she brought up that Patrick was on the autism spectrum. So to me, that explained his awkwardness, and I realized that he's harmless, so I felt bad about my initial judgment of him. The next time that I saw him, I came out into the kitchen and saw him standing there. This struck me as odd, because 1, it was the morning, and I was in my pajamas, having just woken up. 2, he's the maintenance guy. I didn't understand why he should be inside. But I felt bad, so I just smiled and I said g'day. He turned and seemed startled, but explained to me that he was just taking out the trash. I saw that he had actually replaced the bins in the kitchen, so I was just like, oh, okay, he was just trying to be nice, I guess. But I told him that he really didn't have to do that. He just kind of insisted, though, and I was like, alright, whatever. I ended up talking to him again, and again he seemed to have a weird fixation with me being exotic, even though I told him that I was born in Australia. But mostly he was just generally asking how I was finding the place, and he reiterated that everything was super safe, and for some reason brought up the keys to the bedrooms. He said only me, Denise, and he had keys. I didn't say anything out loud, but in my head I thought, wait, since when does he have a key? but in the end, I still just kind of brushed it off. Cut to a few months later, I work about 4 to 6 days a week, casual, as well as going to uni 4 days, so I'm rarely there during the day, and I lock my bedroom door before leaving every day. I don't remember exactly what time of the year this would have been, but it was colder and I hadn't used the ceiling fan in my room for a while. I got home, unlocked my bedroom door, and I noticed that the ceiling fan was on. This struck me as odd immediately because I knew that I hadn't turned it on in like forever. I was very, very confused and thought that I'd turned it on while leaving or something and just didn't remember maybe. I brought it up with my roommate and she just kind of shrugged it off and said, "That's odd," but didn't seem weirded out by it. So I figured that I was just overthinking it. But note too that I kept to myself a lot, wasn't close to any of my roommates, and only talked to this woman occasionally. So a few weeks later, I'm leaving for work and I have a very strange feeling while walking to the front gate of the house. For some reason, I turn around and I see Patrick hiding behind some bushes, staring at me. As soon as he's caught, he turns and pretends to be gardening. In the moment, my mind actually went kind of blank. I was like, surely he wasn't just watching me, right? All I did was frown and kind of wonder to myself why he would stare at me like that, and then pretend that he hadn't been. I come back later in the day though, unlock my door, walk in, and again, something is just off. But this time, I can't put my finger on it. I stand in my room looking around, staring at everything in the room, but I can't find anything when I realize that I don't know what I'm looking for, and I feel creeped out, and I just leave the room and tell my roommate again that I thought someone had been in my room. But this time, she sat down with me and basically said that she thought someone went into her room recently too. We chatted, and she said that she left her bedroom window open when she went to work, and when she came home, it was shut. I brought up the fan again, and my roommate said that maybe we should let Denise know. So I texted Denise and said something along the lines of, "I think someone's going into my room because of X and Y events," and my roommate said the same thing. I exchanged a few messages with Denise, but the general response from her was just, "Oh wow, that's so bizarre." Again, being super naive and young and way too polite for my own good, I assumed that I was just overreacting and didn't want to seem like a bad tenant. Thankfully, it turns out Denise was more sympathetic than I realized because she said that she was going to have the locks changed the next day. I was like, great, thanks, and assumed that that would be it. But in my head I was thinking, only 3 people have the keys, me, Denise, and Patrick. So if someone had been coming in, wouldn't it have had to have been one of the 3 of us? Which is why I didn't feel good when Patrick showed up the next day to change the lock himself, being the maintenance guy and all. I ended up leaving while he did the change, got a text later saying that it was done and new keys were in the mailbox. Fast forward now, and I'd now been at this place for nearly a year. By now I was aware that Patrick seemed to come over about twice a week, and he always came inside the house to take out the rubbish, but never seemed to really do maintenance work. I chalked it up to Denise giving him a job because maybe he couldn't find one elsewhere, and I tried to avoid him. As far as I remember, nothing else seemed strange until now, and I came home from work again and walk in to my bedroom. And while I'm getting my clothes to shower, I noticed something very, very strange that was definitely not there when I left. There was some whitish pale gunk kind of splattered upwards on the wall and the floor. Honestly, my first thought when looking at it after a while was like, that looks like donut glaze or something. I leaned closer to it, but still didn't really register what the stuff was, only that I definitely didn't spill anything at all in here. So again, I got creeped, went to the kitchen, grabbed the chucks and wiped it up. When I had the thought like, wait, is that... I really didn't know what to look for, but as soon as I had that thought, nothing could convince me otherwise, and again, my door had been locked. Only myself, Denise, and Patrick had keys. My roommate wasn't home, but I called Denise right away. She didn't answer, so instead I messaged her and said basically someone had been in my room and there was some weird stuff splattered on the wall. I wanted to see if she came to the same conclusion that I did, but her response this time was really off. She messaged me back hours later and was dismissive, said something like, "Yeah, very bizarre, the locker's been changed though," and I was like, "Yeah, obviously, so who do you think would have been in there?" I felt so weird and kind of grossed out that I went to a friend's place and messaged my stepdad about it. I told him everything for the first time too, and I guess that it sounds a lot worse all at once because his response was, "Hell no, you're moving out of there." I called Denise and I told her that I was moving out if the issue wasn't taken seriously. And this is when I realized that the leasing situation at this place was really dodgy, which I didn't know beforehand due to lack of experience and no sense to ask. But essentially, there was no record of me actually being a tenant, and I was just kind of sending money into this lady's bank account, but there wasn't any official paperwork. I looked back over the stuff that I'd signed when I initially moved in, and it was actually typed up by Denise, I assume. I don't remember details, but it wasn't official at all, and again, super naive and young. So I was able to move out ASAP. Denise didn't put up a fuss about the short notice, and when I came back the next day, the stuff on the wall was gone, so I didn't have any proof of what had actually happened. But that at least just kind of confirmed to me that something weird was going on with Denise and Patrick. My stepdad helped me take all my stuff out. I didn't have much. Denise just left a message and said, "Please leave the keys on the counter." And it took me a few weeks to process every creepy thing that happened throughout my stay there and put it all together as a kind of a massive creep fest. My roommate left soon after that as well, and months later, she actually messaged me to say that one of the old housemates told her that the police were called to the place and they don't know why or what happened, but I suspect that it wasn't for the tenants. About 4 years ago, I was a line cook at a restaurant that was located in a hotel. I worked at this restaurant for nearly 2 years with no problem walking the half-mile or so distance that it took me to reach the bus that I took to get home from my job. But this restaurant had a partnership with the hotel for late-night room service. So, pretty much every night after closing the restaurant, one, sometimes two, line cooks would stay after until 3 a.m., preparing simple things like salads, sandwiches, and wraps that would then be taken to the rooms via hotel employees. Now, me being a recent college grad in my early 20s would always volunteer myself for the extra hours. The student loans and rent cost a lot of dollars. And as I said prior, I had worked this job for a decent amount of time with no problems. Except for one rainy night that I'll never forget. As I left my work that morning around 3 a.m., I realized that I'd messed up when I forgot an umbrella that day. I now had to make my normal walk under decent rainfall. After lighting a cigarette and putting in my headphones, I was ready to make my unfortunate journey, though. I started on my normal routine walking back, cutting through the alleyways that I'd memorized as my shortcuts through the city. And about halfway through my walk, a car started following next to me with the passenger window down. Aware of my surroundings, I had recognized this, but decided to mind my business and keep my head down and just keep walking. Growing up in a rough neighborhood taught me better than to put my nose where it doesn't belong. Unfortunately, though, that wasn't enough. Over the music coming from my headphones, I could hear shouting coming from the car. I turned to face the car driver, but didn't stop walking. He looked back at me, and it was a white man in his late 30s, early 40s, with a bandana and sunglasses on. I remember thinking that it was odd that he was driving with sunglasses so late in the night. But he said, "Hey man, where are you heading?" And I could hear him say that. At this point, I took one of the earbuds out and replied, "What's it to you?" To which he answered, "I figured I'd ask. You look like you need a ride to get out of the rain." I told the guy that I'm all set and that I was almost at my destination anyway. Now keep in mind, I'm still walking and he's driving slowly next to me on this side of the street at 3 a.m. He replied with, "No problem. Do you smoke weed, man?" At this point, I was annoyed with this guy. I had just gotten done working 13 hours in a kitchen, and all I wanted to do was listen to some damn music and unwind before bed. I told the guy, "No man, I don't," even though I actually do. But I replied in a stern and obviously annoyed tone this time. He just looked at me, almost like he knew that I was bullcrapping him. I said, "Have a good night," before replacing my earphone back into my ear and taking a ride up a one-way side street, losing him in the process. I arrived at my bus stop safely, and with about 10 minutes to spare. I was the only one there besides one other man and a homeless man sleeping on a bench some ways up, and after about 3 minutes, the car pulls up to the side of the curb, directly in the bus lane. This time, I'm actually facing him. He rolled down the window and said, "You're heading to the south side, huh?" I replied, "How do you know?" And he pointed above me. I looked up, and on the digital board it says the next bus destination and time. He said to me, "Do you want to lift there? I'm heading that way." And at this point, I was all set and the hood came out of me. I told him, "Hey man, I don't know you and I don't want to ride with you, so move." He just stared at me again, but this time I stared back. We locked eyes for a good 20 seconds before the bus approached behind him, honking loudly. The guy checked his rearview mirror, rolled up the window, and just sped off. On the way home, I remember looking behind me and my surroundings to make sure this creep didn't try to follow me home. Luckily, he didn't, and when I got off the bus, I was in my apartment safe within about 5 minutes. But fast forward a few weeks, and one of my buddies who I work with asked me if I heard about the body the cops found in a dumpster behind the grocery store, less than 5 minutes from the hotel. I told him no, but he said that the body of a girl was found strangled to death, and the cops are on the lookout for the killer that's still at large. The cops had no evidence and were asking for people to come forward with additional information. I hadn't told my buddy or anyone besides my girlfriend at that time what had happened that night. And when I told him the story, he insisted that I call the cops and tell them what happened. I told him that I would, but in truth, I never actually did. Call me old school, but like I said earlier, I learned growing up to just mind my own business and avoid trouble, and trouble won't find me. So that's what I did. To this day, I still haven't heard anything more on the case. I wonder if it was the same guy, and I think about how weird it was for him to approach me the way that he did, at such an odd hour of the day. The sunglasses, the following me to the bus stop. That stuff doesn't normally happen, right? Anyway, after that experience, I started walking home with my knife in my pocket, and walked with only one earphone in the whole time so that I could hear my surroundings better. I also stopped volunteering for the overnight shift as well. I do hope that whoever killed that girl gets caught, or at least has a change of heart. It's crazy just how fragile life is. Hey. This happened when I was about 10, I think, or at least around that age. I'm 15 now. So, I'd been at my cousin's wedding, which was across the country, and we had to stay in her hotel at the time. We'd been up since 8 a.m. and spent the whole day celebrating, so everyone was very tired. My dad had been drinking and wasn't able to drive us back to the hotel, so my mum, my sister and I made plans to get a lift from my auntie and my uncle. My dad and my brother went with my other auntie and uncle. Anyway, we had left the venue and had been driving for about 10 minutes down a dark, deserted one-way road. Everything was fine. I was sitting in the back seat with my mum and my sister, and we're all just chatting, although I was kind of half asleep. And that was until my uncle cursed under his breath and the car slowed down. This woke me up fully because I knew that the road was very long and there were only trees on this side of it. Also, I was young and I believed that cursing was a terrible sin at the time. But when the car completely stopped, I sat up a bit, trying to see what was going on. Then, to my horror, I saw a man walking towards the car. This wouldn't have been as scary as it was if it weren't pitch black, in the middle of nowhere, and if the man didn't have a load of glass shards in his face. It was truly just a horrifying sight. There were pieces of glass in his skin, and it was just so bloody, and there was even a big shard sticking out of his cheek. He knocked on the window and motioned for my auntie to roll down her window. She rolled it down a bit, and my uncle asked, "What do you want?" The man with this glass in his face asked, "Could you give me and a friend a ride to the hospital?" Friend, I thought to myself. I couldn't see another man. That's when a second man walked out from the bushes, and he also had glass in his face, and it was also really bloody. The second man walked over to the driver's side of the car where my uncle was. He asked my uncle to roll down his window as well. My uncle complied, but like my auntie, he only rolled it down a small bit. And the guy asked, "Can you please give us a ride?" My auntie told him, "I'm sorry, but there isn't any room." The first man looked at the back seat as if he didn't believe my auntie. He made eye contact, and it was probably the scariest 5 seconds that I've ever experienced. Just then, he pulled on the handle of the car door and it opened. This is when I started to panic, and I could feel my mum tense up. My auntie struggled with the man to try and close the door. Luckily, though, the man seemed like he'd been drinking, so he wasn't as strong as he would have been if he was sober. The second man didn't seem to be doing much, he just kind of seemed to be watching the whole thing play out. Finally, my auntie was able to close the door and locked it. She said, "Please just take this, I'm sorry," and she scrambled out a $20 note. I can't remember if the man actually took it or not, but the last thing that I do remember about that night was my uncle driving away as fast as he could. After that, I think that I fell asleep or I was in shock from what had just happened. But I wonder now, what would have happened if there was room in the car? Would the men have tried to hurt us, or were they actually in a terrible accident and genuinely needed a ride? I don't know, but I'm just thankful that we got away that night, with everyone pretty much unscathed. I'm an 18-year-old female with 2 female roommates of the same age. We just moved to a very big city, and we live in a small apartment complex with a classic dark, scary back alley, which just so happens to be where my roommate's parking spot is located as well. So, I work overnight, and one night I got off work at around 12:30, midnight. My roommate picked me up, and we headed home. We were being pretty loud, talking and laughing as we made our way around the building and up to the stairs to our apartment. And the second that we got in and sat down on the couch, our doorbell rang. We were, of course, very confused, and from our position on the couch, we can see out the window to our outer door. The way that our apartment is arranged, you unlock a door to get into a hallway that has doors leading to our apartment, and our neighbours as well, but it looks like the outer door leads directly into our apartment from the outside. And there's a large, middle-aged man outside our door. He sees us sitting on the couch and starts talking to us, asking us to open the door, that he needs help. He tells us that someone is trying to rob him, and he needs us to open the door and call the police for him. We immediately jump up and step out of view of the window, obviously not near stupid enough to open the door. We hear our neighbour's door open though. 2 males live next door to us, and they're very nice. We peek out into the hallway and tell him what's going on. He opens the door, talks to the man, tells him to wait outside while he gets his phone. We can hear their exchange through the window. Our late-night visitor tells our neighbour that he has a bunch of silver ingots or something on him and that they're worth a lot of money. Some guy was trying to rob him right outside and he needs someone to call the cops. The neighbour complies, but while he's ringing the police, the guy just takes off running, never to be seen again. The cops never showed up either. And I know that that isn't a big deal, but that asking for help thing is a classic serial killer ploy apparently. Plus, he was supposedly getting robbed right outside where we just were, and we didn't hear or see a thing. It has bad intentions written all over it, but either way, we were left pretty creeped out that night. So I had a creepy experience that I never really thought too much about, but I figured that I'd share it. So one morning, probably around 4 a.m. I think, I woke up to a very strange kind of growling of voice. I guess I moved and looked over my shoulder. My boyfriend noticed that I was awake and said, "You heard that too, right?" Confused, I said yes, it woke me up. He said that he woke up to this feeling of an evil presence to the left side of the room in the corner. He said that he was laying there and began praying silently, and it was while he prayed that this thing began growling and speaking something that he couldn't understand. After I woke up, it apparently stopped. It wasn't one of our pets, I can assure you of that. The windows were closed. It wasn't from outside or another room, because it sounded as clear as someone talking to you only 10 feet away. I've had a couple of other strange things happen in this apartment too. Once when I was washing dishes, a screw flew across the room and hit me in the center of my back. Above me was ceiling, there were no lights or anything, and from where it hit me, it had definitely been thrown. It's all kind of interesting, and we're currently looking at a house built in 1883 to move into from this apartment, so secretly I kinda hope this next place is haunted as well. Call me crazy, but I enjoy the thrill. So I'm on a trip backpacking around Europe with my brother, currently in Paris. We're staying in this hostel and we're in a 10-bunk bedroom. There was this one guy in the room who was immediately super weird. Almost right away, in fact. Like, as soon as we got settled, he starts talking to us about flying to Libya. He's all, us Libya, fly tomorrow, and me and my brother were just like, no dude. He keeps saying it though, and we keep saying no, and he's getting progressively more assertive about it. As me and my brother are going around doing some sightseeing and stuff, I keep seeing this dude around as well. When we're at the hostel, he kept following us to the dining hall, out onto the terrace, and I'm getting more and more creeped out. My brother, ever the non-assertive soul that he is, just laughs it off like the dude is joking. This goes on for 2 days, and well, this morning, we were going out to breakfast, and I forgot my phone back in the room, so I told my brother to just go ahead, and I ran back to get it. I go in the room, and the dude is sitting there. There's no one else in the room, and I honestly contemplated just leaving it. But I didn't trust it alone in the room, so I planned to just grab it quickly. That morning he was still on about Libya, and was essentially bending over our beds going on about it, despite me repeatedly telling him to stop talking to us. I go in and grab my phone when he suddenly just yells, "Libya, now, we go now." I'm very scared since at this point, we're the only ones in this room, and I just say, "No, dude," and I go to leave when he blocks the door and grabs my shoulder, still going on about going to the airport and flying to Libya. I shove past him and run away to where my brother and I were going to breakfast. I decided that we're going to switch rooms because this dude was officially creep level 100. We make it back to the hostel, and before we talk to the front desk, we went outside for a smoke, and he shows up. I almost yell at him this time to leave us alone, and he just flat out says no. I go to the front desk and explain that this dude has been harassing us and we wanted to change rooms. I mentioned what went down in the room, and before I knew it, the cops were called and I was giving a statement. As they were sorting it out though, there were a couple of things that really jumped out at me. The first was that this guy didn't pay in advance. Normally when you're staying in a hostel, you pay the full amount up front, or if you're staying for a while, you pay weekly. He was apparently paying by the day. And the second thing, he had several pieces of ID in his wallet, none of which matched his description. Apparently Paris has been having a problem with human trafficking, and this guy was escorted out of the hostel by the police. He was banned from staying there again ever, and me and my brother switched rooms and were given vouchers for free dinners for the rest of our stay there. And now, I'm terrified to go out by myself. I swear, if me and that guy had been alone in a more secluded place that didn't have cameras everywhere, I'm pretty sure that I would have been shipped off to Libya. So I was only a baby when this happened, and this is technically my mum's story. A bit of background. My mum had me pretty young. She was 21 and she wasn't married. Her and my dad were only dating when I was born, and she was about 22 when this whole thing occurred. They both went to the same church with friends that they had met in high school, Louis, Christine, and Quill. My mum was riding in Quill's car at the time. I was a 1-year-old in the back seat. Mum basically took me everywhere, and everyone was heading towards a church event that they were all excited for. Louis, my dad, and Christine were all in separate cars, but they trailed Quill because they were all heading in the same place anyway. At some point, my mum and Quill were stuck at a stoplight. They were chatting until my mum says that she just got this really uneasy feeling. She never had a problem with people keeping their doors unlocked, but she just couldn't shake how she felt at that moment. Finally, she spoke up, requesting what she suddenly felt was necessary. She said, "Hey Quill, can you please lock the doors?" Quill was confused. It was an odd thing for my mum, the monarch of never locking doors, to ask this. And he said, "What? Wait, why?" And she said, "I don't know, I just have a feeling about it." Quill didn't object, locking the doors just as my mother asked. The light went green and everyone drove off. It wasn't until the next stoplight that my mum and Quill both experienced something that sure made them glad that they had actually locked the doors. As they sat there chatting away, these two guys from a car next to them got out of their vehicles. Mind you, we're on a road with a bunch of other people next to us, so these guys must have been drunk or high or something. But quickly, they make their way over to Quill's car, one on each side. They begin to feverishly pull on the door handles, trying desperately to get it open. My mum and Quill screamed. They were still at a stoplight and couldn't move without hitting the cars next to them. And after realizing that my mum's door didn't work, one of them went for the door closest to me. He tried to open it with all of his might, until him and his douchebag buddy started to try and break the windows. Thankfully, the light turned green, and Quill sped them out of there quickly. My mum and Quill were both in shock. Christine called them, freaking out because she saw the whole thing from a couple of cars behind. She asked them if they were okay, which, although being in shock, they weren't harmed. My dad called her and told her that he and Louie were going to handle it, which my mum believed, and they all went on their way. To this day, my mum says that she still doesn't know what my dad and Louie did to the guys. My dad said that he found them, but that's all that he would say about it. Louie acted similarly, not speaking of what happened, and even after my parents got married and got divorced, she still doesn't have a clue. The first year of middle school, a lot of things happened that I believe really shouldn't have. About a month before school started, a day before my birthday in fact, I got my period for the first time. I know, sorry for that, but it's actually important to the story. I called my friend a few days afterward to tell her. I was a bit of an early bloomer, so I was one of the first in my friend group to start. Well, later on, this particular friend of mine and I got into a fight, and her retaliation was to start a rumor about me around the school that I was pregnant and had sex with a high schooler. Throughout the day, I noticed people giving me weird looks, and I had no idea what it was about until my friends told me. I came home bawling my eyes out, and my sister knew why. Being in a small town, rumors spread like wildfire, and everyone already knew about it. This girl at the school that my sister was at told her about it, and she went off at her. This started a whole chain of events, with me crying, figuring out who it was, and my mum at the principal's not leaving until they promised to do something about it. It slowly started getting better, but walking home from school, I live nearly across the street, became just hell. I never learned this guy's name, but the first day he followed me around on his bike with his best friend. They circled around me, so I had to stop walking, ask me personal questions, which I'd either stay silent or say something snappy, and just a bunch of things to purposefully make me uncomfortable. On the third day, he kept making sexual comments about my body to the point that even his friend said, "Too far, man." After that, he never had his friend with him, and I just kind of broke down a few days of it happening. I was always a really shy, quiet kid. I spent most of elementary school just not talking to anyone. I had no idea how to handle it, and I was scared to ask for help because I didn't think anybody would believe me or take it too seriously. And so I simply just didn't say anything. The last day of it happening, though, I think was the worst. He had a group of girls behind him all cheering him on as he was harassing me, and one of them laughed and said, "You should stalk her." And he actually agreed with her, and I'd finally had enough, and I started screaming and cussing him out. He smirked and said, "Feisty, I like it," and I just ran home. I was already at the halfway point. My sister was waiting for me at the front door that day with our dog, only a few months old, so she had heard the whole thing, and she didn't do that often, but it seemed like perfect timing, and she looked panicked and was just like, "Are you okay? Do I need to hurt someone?" and told me that I need to report that to the school. I said that I was fine though and it was taken care of. She was reluctant, but she let it go. But then he walked past my house and our dog jumped in front of me and started growling at him. He just sort of chuckled, which really freaked both me and my sister out. A few months before, our house had actually gotten broken into, and because I was home alone a lot, my mum decided to get me a dog to protect me. She's a sweetheart, though, and lets people pat her and everything. That's why my sister would sometimes wait for me outside and let kids pet her. But he was one of the only people that she's ever growled at. I'm really afraid that if I didn't stand up for myself or had a dog, that he would have actually followed up on the threat of stalking me. I only saw him around school a couple of times, or once on the student news because he was on the football team and got this award or something. I almost started crying when I saw it, and when he went up to my lunch table because my friend asked him a question and he stared at me the entire time. The last time that I saw him was the last day of school, and I was getting things out of my locker, and when I walked past him, his breath hitched and he just looked at me the entire time that I was in the hallway. There are a lot of reasons why I hate that town, but after I graduated from 8th grade, he was the biggest reason why I didn't want to go to that high school there. I'm glad that my mum accepted and we moved into the city, and I've had to deal with a fair share of creeps, but he was by far the worst of them. When I was young, I lived in my uncle's basement apartment with my grandparents. This damn place just always gave out the most creepiest of vibes, especially when I was there alone. It had those gnarly yellow light bulbs in the early 90s splashing light off the brick-walled interior, and it just gave the whole place an eerie yellowish-brown tinge. It always just gave me the creeps. Now, one early fall evening, my grandpa was out with friends while my grandma would do the usual Sunday afternoon ritual where she would make a gigantic pot of whatever stew or curry dish and she would break it down into serve-size portions and then freeze them to be used or eaten throughout the week. The house was old and getting to the point where creaks and bangs from walls were a pretty normal occurrence. I was also convinced that parts of the floor were unlevel, as the door to my bedroom, when opened to a certain angle, would slowly begin to close on its own, making a creaking noise the whole way. So for example, if you open the door at a 90-degree angle, it would slowly close itself to a 25 angle, but never actually slam shut. The windows were spread out throughout the basement, but they were those slim 9 by 18 inches or whatever sliding windows that were way up top of the wall and too high for me or Grandma to reach without using a chair. Only Grandpa was tall enough to access them without help. So, on this Sunday afternoon, my grandma proceeds to start cooking as the choice of curry dish that she had thought up required a good 4 to 5 hour slow simmer. I was in the living room or family room just kind of bouncing around, building planes out of Lego and playing rescue missions with the little Lego men. In the kitchen, the stove was in the corner, and across the stove, maybe a good 6-foot gap, was the fridge. Above the stove was one of the windows that I mentioned earlier. So, Grandma starts the simmer and casually joins me in the living or the family room and turns on a movie as she normally would on a Sunday afternoon. I wasn't really into the movie at first. It was some foreign one, but once the action scene started with all the kung fu and the fists flying, I was pretty captivated, so I joined her on the couch, spellbound by all those explosions and people fighting all over the place. Occasionally, every 10 to 15 minutes or so, my Grandma would pause the movie to go check on whatever she was cooking as the aroma started to fill the entire basement, and I'm sure the whole upstairs house as well. Sometimes I would join her, being the curious little tyke that I was, and ask questions like, "Did you use tomatoes today? Is there meat in there? Where did you learn how to make this?" Grandma always responded and explained in detail. She was always proud of making food for us. So, as we're nearing the end of the movie, we are both startled by a loud bang and a crashing noise. My grandma jumps off the couch and goes dashing into the kitchen with me maybe 3 steps behind her. And what I saw that day, I still can't explain. The big pot of food that I was mentioning was laying next to the fridge on the other side of the kitchen. The curry had splashed all over the wall and spilled all over the floor, and some of it even on the fridge. In my panicked state, I stream off stuff like what the hell questions for Grandma, who went eerily silent as she grabbed towels and began cleaning up this crazy mess. I began helping her and pointing out stupid little details because I still don't understand how this pot flew like 5 or 6 feet through the air and seems to be what hit the fridge before it came crashing to the floor as if someone had picked it up and thrown it across the kitchen. But my grandma, she just stayed silent until it was cleaned up. Once cleaned, we began inspecting the area to now come up with a conclusion of what could have happened. The windows were all closed because, being fall, the basement can get quite cold in the fall and winter months in Canada. They were also way too small for someone to fit through and escape in a matter of seconds, or to be opened from the outside. We tried this many times as kids, in fact, when we forgot our keys and we were locked out after school, and going through that window was just never an option. The simmering pot could have vibrated off the stove, I suppose, but then how did it get like 6 feet across the kitchen and slam into the fridge like that? A few hours later, my grandpa came home and, me being like 8 or 9 years old, ran over screaming. The curry went flying. Of course, he just gave me a big hug and ignored me, figuring that I'm just being a nutty little kid. But that's when my grandma grabbed him, pulling him into the room and closing the door behind them. I snuck up to the door to hear what they were saying, but I couldn't make anything out. But my grandpa is a pretty serious ex-military guy who doesn't really have a sense of humor or mess around unless it comes to us grandkids. And then he's a total clown, making funny faces, telling jokes and stories about whatever he felt was fitting to help guide us youngsters along. He always pushed us to be curious and always helped find answers to the questions that we had. But once he came out of that room, his demeanor was just different. He wasn't his usual smiling, let's play games with grandkids form. He was quiet, rigid, and in thought. They went into the kitchen and he looked around. I stayed quiet behind both my grandparents, just observing and trying to make sense of it all. We ended up ordering pizza that night, and during pizza, like stupid kids do and they can't let go of things, I brought up the issue again with my grandpa. He stayed quiet the whole time, and my grandma responded with, "We're not going to be talking about that anymore," in a very stern voice, and I felt like I was sort of in some kind of trouble or something. I never once brought it back up after that, and to this day I still can't explain the mysterious case of the flying curry. So the neighborhood that I grew up in was fairly small. The neighborhood was shaped like a T, and there were maybe 20 houses total along the 2 streets that made it up, that is. Now, across the road from our little community was a large church with a huge graveyard. The church was situated in a gentle bowl-like curve in the road so that the road had a bend on it either side, and you couldn't see the church or the graveyard coming from either direction. Some of the graves in this graveyard were in fact old enough that the names and the dates had been worn away by the elements, but the grounds were well cared for and never got overgrown or anything. It was a stark juxtaposition to the tangled woods that lurked behind the church, that's for sure, always hungry to encroach on the manicured grass and neat rows of the headstones. Overall, it was just kind of too perfect, chillingly idyllic, if that's the right way to express it, and vaguely threatening, particularly because of its picturesque appearance. I mean, honestly, I can't say that I even remember a single time that the grass was allowed to grow too long, weeds were never allowed to creep into the flowers planted at each grave, or a single flower was allowed to wilt on the plants, or anything. But the biggest issue, though, was that this graveyard was very haunted. The whole neighborhood was, really, including my childhood home. At night, large blue orbs would bob slowly between the graves at about chest height, like ghostly lanterns. The church parishes would tell stories about cold spots, visions of lost loved ones, prayer candles mysteriously snuffing out on their own, and Bibles and hymn books being flung onto the floor by unseen hands, and just everything. But the most terrifying and common apparition that came from this church was the graveyard hitchhiker, or that's what we called it anyway. I personally encountered her on 3 separate occasions, and everyone in the neighborhood had seen her at least once. She caused several wrecks, and some with casualties even, over the 20 years that I lived there, and it was said that anyone who died because of her would be forced to wander with her until she found peace. The first time that I saw her, I was just a kid, maybe 6 or 7. It was a Friday, and my dad picked me up from the elementary school, and, as per tradition, he had taken me to the bread box for a blue raspberry slush and a 50-cent old-fashioned mini cherry pie. You all know the ones that I mean, right? But he made me pinky promise not to tell my mum because she'd get mad that he'd spoil me before dinner and all that. So, there I am in the passenger seat of Dad's little red Ford S10, munching on the last bit of my pie as we pull up to the entrance street to our neighborhood, when a woman dashes out of the graveyard directly in front of my dad's car. He slams the brakes so hard that they screech, and they stop the truck just in time to only tap the palms of the woman's hands where she had thrown them out in front of her. And immediately, I knew that something was wrong. Her light auburn hair was snarled and had bits of leaves and twigs caught in it. The summer dress that she was wearing was torn, and blood was sleeping onto the brightly patterned cloth in several places. She also had a split lip and a black eye and several cuts and bruises on her. My dad rolls down the window and asks if she's okay and if she needs help. Immediately, she gets hysterical, sobbing and tears streaking her cheeks, and begs him to take her to the nearest hospital. She says that her life depends on it and begs him to please hurry and help her. My dad has me scoot to the middle of the bench seat, and this woman opens the door, gets in and buckles up. Her arm brushes mine as the seatbelt clicks in place, and I shudder because I had never felt skin just so cold like that. My dad pulls into the church parking lot, reverses, and heads towards the St. Mary's Hospital that's about 15 minutes from our house, I'd say. But as soon as we round the bend in the road, she just vanishes. Like, right before our eyes, she's just gone. The seatbelt is still buckled, and we could still see the print of her hand on the window, but she was just gone, just like that. I get pretty freaked out, and I start to cry. My dad gets out looking around, knocking on doors and asking if anyone has seen her. And after about 10 minutes, my dad gets back into the truck looking puzzled and pale, and we just go home. We don't mention this at home, and I decide eventually not to tell Mum or my sisters so that they wouldn't laugh, call me crazy, or say my imagination was acting up again. But Dad had seen her. He knew too, and he didn't talk about it too, so I decided that I wouldn't either. After a few days, I'd forgotten the whole incident and didn't spare this ghost another thought. Well, that is, until years later when she stopped my mum. By this time, I was an angry and sullen 7th grader who liked loud rock music, preferred books to people, and was constantly getting in trouble at school. This particular day, Mum was bringing me home after a meeting with the principal. I'd gotten into a fight in my lunch period with 3 other students. Mum was furious at me because I'd punched one boy and bitten another after they dumped my lunch tray on the floor. The principal had called her in for a meeting after school to discuss what to do about my behavior. And as it was sometime in the fall, it was already starting to get dark when we headed home at about 4:30. This time, though, when the woman ran out in front of us, in that self-same summer dress, despite the chill in the air, she was just too close, and Mum wasn't able to hit the brakes fast enough, and we actually hit her. Not hard enough to cause serious damage, but enough to make her fall. You could hear the thud as the van made contact with her stomach and the nasty wet sound of a body hitting concrete. It always makes me cringe thinking about that too. My mum obviously freaks out, but she has knee and feet problems and she didn't get out of the car. She opens the door and leaned a little out as the woman shakily stood. My mum asked if she was okay and needed an ambulance, but didn't get an answer. As soon as the woman looked up, my mum shut up and whispered, "Oh my goodness." The woman stumbled as if drunk towards my mum, and my mum instinctively pulled the door closed to keep a barrier between her and the ghost. The woman asks my mum to please take her to a hospital, and my mum refuses. She says that she can call an ambulance, but she'll not give the woman a ride. And at this point, she gets really upset, and she just starts shrieking. My already upset mum shrieks back that she won't risk her daughter's life to give a stranger a ride. The ghost girl falls silent and looks at her for a moment before looking at me and begging, "Help, please help." I stutter out something about not being old enough to drive, and the ghost wails, "You could have helped me." And then, again, she literally just vanished without a trace. That night, my mum mentions it at dinner, and my dad and my brother and older sisters get really pale and quiet. But the ghost woman is all mum can talk about for a week, and I start to pick up on the fact that my sisters may have seen this thing too. I start asking some of the other kids in the neighborhood, and they tell me wild tales about lost souls and how this ghost is responsible for all the car accidents that happen near the church. I'm pretty freaked out, but some part of me is still skeptical enough to scoff, despite my own experiences with this said ghost. But the last time that I saw her was just a few months later. So I was hanging out at the church trick-or-treat with the 3 siblings who lived across the street from me. It was freezing out, and I was dressed as a vampire. Despite the dress covering basically everything important, the material was still thin, and the cape that I was wrapped in didn't add much warmth. But at some point, the parents of the kids that I was with ran out of the candy that they brought to the trunk or treat, packed us up in the car, and started to pull out of the parking lot. And just as they pulled out onto the road to cross over into our neighbour's entrance, their mum screamed for her husband to stop as this woman darted straight in front of the car. I only just barely caught a glimpse of that same bloodied sundress and her wide brown eyes for an instant. He slammed the brakes and the car went skidding down the small inclined church driveway, spinning in a full circle before slamming into the curb beside someone's driveway. All of us kids were shrieking at the tops of our lungs, but the ghost was nowhere to be seen. Some of the people still attending the trunk or treat ran over to check on us, and after verifying that no one was hurt, they sent us on our way. I haven't run across her again, but once a man crashed his tractor into a ditch over this ghost while I was in high school, and there was almost constantly at least 3 accidents every year around the curves in the road, leaving drivers and passengers disoriented and asking about this mysterious woman. Now that I've moved across the city, though, each time my fiancé and I visit my parents, I kind of expect that woman to appear in front of our car at some point. My fiancé thinks that I'm just telling spooky stories, but who knows? Maybe one day she'll stop him and beg for help again. So I was at a concert of my co-worker that time, and it wasn't really good, and at a church in a small town, 40 minutes away by car from the town that I lived. And when it was over, I found out that I missed my last bus. I asked my co-worker if I could sleep at his place, but he rejected it. So I did what I always do in such a situation. I walked. It was the time before smartphones, so the only way for me to find the right path was by reading the street signs and hope for the best. I'll also admit that I cried the entire time while I was walking. It was 2 a.m, though, when I arrived at the next train station. I thought that I could take a ride with a cab, but there were no cabs. I didn't know what to do, so I waited at the place where the cab should be, and I smoked a cigarette. Should I walk the way home? Another hour by foot, or even more at least. Should I wait until a cab shows up, or the first train in the morning? I didn't know what to do. But then, a car showed up and stopped in front of me. The man inside rolled down the passenger window and spoke to me. "Hey, can you give me a light, please?" he said. I wasn't comfortable at all going over to him, but I did. I gave him a light and quickly turned around and stood at the same place as before. He didn't drive away, though, and asked where I had to go, and I said in which town that I lived, and he invited me to get into his car. He said that it was on the way and he could bring me home. After thinking about it for some time, too, I really just don't know why I even got in the car. I didn't even want to, but I guess I was tired. The ride itself wasn't bad at all. We had a bit of small talk, and he drove the usual route that I knew, and he wasn't creepy at all while driving, and I thought maybe he was just really a nice guy, just trying to help me out. So I guided him to my house, but he didn't stop in front of it. Instead, he drove a bit further away. I thanked him and gave him my lighter as a gift, and when I was about to open the door and leave the car, he said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" I was surprised by this sudden mood change, and I asked, caught off guard, "What?" I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of, "That's not how you thank someone who drove you home in the middle of the night. I expect you to do another favor for me in return." Something like that anyway. I kind of understood what he implied, but, well, I'm no hooker. So I chuckled a little bit, thanked him again, gave him the lighter, and I got out of the car. I was walking towards my home too, when I heard him opening the door and closing it. The door of his car, that is. And then the sound of him running towards me. I looked over my shoulder and saw him getting closer to me. I shrieked, kind of like a mouse, and I started running as well. At the door of my home, I quickly opened it, got inside, locked it, ran upstairs to my bedroom, locked my door as well, and just hid under my blanket. I got away, and nothing else happened that night. He didn't do anything else, and he left, and after that, I never saw him again. So my friend in the neighborhood found a Ouija board in his brother's stuff while he was away at college. He told me what it was and asked me if I wanted to play it with him. Trying to impress him, I said yes, and we went into his room and we tried it out. But nothing happened, and we were left pretty disappointed. But later that week he called me and told me that he looked up how to use the board properly and wanted to give it another go. I agreed, as I was pretty confident nothing would happen again. So we grabbed a bunch of scented candles and we placed them around the board and did the whole seance stuff. We asked the board if anyone was there, and it, of course, went to yes. We thought the other was messing around, but we agreed to take it seriously because I didn't really care if it was just a stupid joke. But we asked the ghost what its name was, and it spelled out Owen. My friend asked if it was a person, and it went to no. We asked what it was, and it actually spelt out demon. I then asked for it to prove it, and you know that call into the intro to Finding Bigfoot? Well, that's the closest thing to what we heard from the garage. But keep in mind, it was only us in the house, and it scared the absolute crap out of us, and we just ran straight out of the house. We also checked the garage after a while, but there was nothing. Anyway, a few weeks go by, and he tells me how he's having paranormal experiences in his house. He feels like he's being watched whenever he's downstairs in the kitchen and the living room. He feels someone sitting on the end of his bed every night, and every time that he walks past the garage, he feels someone grab his wrist and pull it towards the garage. Whenever I went over, I always got that feeling that someone was looking at me from the ceiling. It was definitely weird and unnatural. But then came the scariest part of all. So we were at his house playing Army in his room while no one else was home when we began to hear these heavy footsteps downstairs, except whatever was making it obviously had hooves or something. In fact, it sounded like a full-grown horse was walking around downstairs. Then we heard someone begin to laugh and cough at the same time. My friend ran over and slammed the door shut, and we hid. He hid under his bed while I hid in the closet. But then it sounded like someone began scratching his door with like one big claw or something. He started crying, and I was honestly on the verge of tears as well. My friend yelled, "Leave us alone, Owen, you're scaring us," and it began to stop, and then we heard it run down the stairs. My friend got up and threw me out of the closet and grabbed the Ouija board that was in there with me. He ran down the stairs, ripped the screen door off of his gas fireplace, threw the thing in there, put the screen back on, and went to turn it on. But when he was just about to turn it on, we heard a loud moan from the basement, which was right behind my friend. He flicked the fireplace on and the board began to burn. And that was pretty much the end of it, and we just played outside since he was way too scared to go back into the house until his parents got home. His parents came home and saw that he'd burned his brother's Ouija board. They grounded him and threw the burnt board away. But after that, there was no more paranormal experiences in my friend's house anymore. But if anyone ever asks me to join in on a seance or with Ouija boards ever again, that's exactly why I will never take part in any of these games ever again. So I, a 21 female, used to live in a really bad neighborhood when I was a kid. Drive-by shootings were not uncommon. Rapes had happened in surrounding houses while we lived there, and before we moved, we also found out that the sweet man across the street was actually a certified sex offender. So, obviously, not a great place for children to walk around alone, right? True, but if you have a 70-pound good boy that is completely dedicated to protecting you, it's doable. So, my mum, little brother in his stroller, me and Spanky, my good boy, went for a walk around the neighborhood to go 2 blocks away to go to the community pool. I, like most 6-year-olds, wanted to wander ahead with my dog because he was always gentle when I had the lead and walked closely to me. As we were nearing the pool, there was a stretch of hedges that lined the walkway to the pool entrance. Spanky was walking ahead of me by maybe about 3 feet. He sniffed towards a bush and just came to a complete stop. He began posturing and growling deeply, baring his teeth to the bush. He had never growled like this before, and to me, it was kind of horrifying to see my best bud like this. I tried to walk around him, and he turned the back end of his body to block me, his eyes still fixed on the bush. I tried again, and he does it yet again, and my mum is still about 4 houses behind and hasn't noticed this yet. But then I see the bush start to move and take a step back. I say to my mum, "Mum, I think Spanky found a kitty." I start taking a step towards the bush and am knocked over completely by Spanky at this point. I'm crying and on the ground, scraped elbow. No biggie, but it definitely gets my mum running. And exactly at this moment, a man bolts out from the bush and takes off running. When Spanky knocked me over, it made me drop his leash, so he booked it after this guy. About 300 feet away from the bush, Spanky caught up with him and made some sickening contact with this guy's ankles and forearms. Now, I've heard a lot of screams on TV and in movies, but I had never heard a real blood-curdling scream like this before. My mum pulled me close and pulled out her phone, fingers shaking. While she's on the phone with 911, you can hear this guy screaming, "Get him off me," and me going, "Spanky, he's not a kitty." Spanky may have actually mangled a stray cat who wandered into the yard before this, just FYI. But when the police arrived, they asked for a full version of events, and my mum and I gave the details the best that we could. Spanky was sitting contently at our feet after the officers and my mum removed Spanky from this guy. The guy was taken in cuffs, and after a quick checkup by the ambulance, he was fine, just a few good bites. Spanky definitely held back somewhat. But about 10 years later, I asked my mother about it when I was looking through old photo albums and saw a picture of me and Spanky playing in the backyard. She sighed and said, "Oh, you know what happened. We don't need to talk about it." I said, "Well, yeah, but why would he attack some random homeless guy?" And my mum made a really confused face, and I said, "What? That's what happened, right?" She then says, "I guess I can tell you now. I didn't want to tell you back then because I didn't want you to worry, but the man who Spanky pulled out of that bush had been spotted peeking into the houses in the neighborhood that had kids. He was the same man that was hiding in the backyard when you had a sleepover at your friend's house. He had a knife that he dropped when he ran from the bush, and the police thought that he might have been canvassing the neighborhood before he decided who to take, and if it wasn't for Spanky, it might have actually have been you." So yeah, basically, this guy was a complete pedophile that had been spending weeks at night creeping into people's backyards that he knew had children, so that he could break into our rooms individually and kidnap us, and most likely, much worse. I live 300 miles from there now, and still to this day, I cannot handle coming to that stupid hedge, even if I tried. So like I mentioned in my previous story, my boxer actually saved me from almost being kidnapped by someone who scouted us out, and there was a pedophile in the neighborhood who was looking for his chance to strike, but my boy stopped him before he could. But this is actually what led up to this happening, just 1 week beforehand. So like I said in the other story, this was a really bad neighborhood, but it was also full of families with young kids, and most of us in the neighborhood were around the same age and liked to play together. One of my friends was a little girl called Alexis, and we were both 6 years old. We lived right across the street from one another, and we played often when our older sisters who were friends would play too. Most of the time we played in the street, our front yards, or either one of our houses. We also had semi-weekly sleepovers after I had ballet and she had t-ball. But for this particular sleepover, it was Alexis's birthday, so we went door to door in the neighborhood and handed out handmade invitations to the Big 7 sleepover. We went to about 6 or 7 houses, I'd say, to rally our friends, and about 8 little girls in total attended. That night, too, her mum let us set up our sleeping bags in the living room, right next to the sliding glass door that led out to the backyard. This was on the opposite side of the house from her mum's room, but we all insisted on sleeping there, and she obliged in the end because she had work the next evening and just wanted to get some sleep. So we were all playing hide-and-go-seek in the living room and the kitchen when Alexa's big sister suggested that we turn off the lights and play in the dark instead. I, afraid of the dark and still used a nightlight religiously, said no, but was quickly outvoted. We were playing for about 5 minutes, and when I was hiding next to the sliding glass door behind the curtain, I was getting bored and decided to look outside. I look outside and I see this big-ass oak tree in the backyard, and I see a branch move. I squint and I look a little closer, really hoping that I could see an owl or a squirrel or something. The branch moves again, and this time I see 2 glowing circles. I get really excited and think, that's such a huge owl. Those eyes are ginormous. My sister is the seeker and comes over and finds me because she knows that I always hide there. When she tags me, I say, "Hey sissy, look how big the owl's eyes are." And my sister looks and her expression just goes flat. She says there's nothing there, and I begin insisting that I see a giant owl, and she keeps insisting that there isn't an owl. This draws all the other girls over, and eventually all of us start walking over to the glass door to see. The branch shakes again, but a lot more violently this time, and we all let out a little squeal, and I say, "See, I told you." Alexis starts getting excited too, and then says, "Here, let's turn on the outside light so we can see him better." She then turns on the light, and we then see this dude sitting in a tree, trying to scramble down the trunk and getting stuck on a branch. We all lose it and start screaming our heads off. This wakes a mum up who comes running down the hallway with a handgun in her hand and PJs on. She was a single mum in the hood, and it was a good thing to have. The dude manages to get down right as she gets to the glass. And this badass woman opens the glass, runs into her backyard, gun in hand, and says, "You better keep running." Eventually she comes back in and calms all of us down best that she can while she calls the police, and all of our parents too. Since we all live so close though, most of our parents come before the police did. And, unfortunately after that, we didn't get to sleep over at our house ever again. This happened to me about 5 years ago, I think, so some details are a bit fuzzy, but I'm sharing this exactly how I remember it. So when I was in high school, I was best friends with this girl called Sarah. Sarah and I were practically inseparable, and Sarah was what you would consider the cool girl. She was charismatic, spontaneous, rebellious, confident, and incredibly beautiful. She was also somewhat of a bad influence, though. Don't get me wrong, she never pressured me into doing anything that I wasn't comfortable with, i.e. drinking, smoking, older boys, and all that sort of stuff. But she did bring me into some questionable situations, to say the least. But I truly loved her and cherished our friendship. She was the sister that I really never had, and I'm the eldest child and the only girl born to Eastern European immigrants, so naturally, I grew up in a very strict and controlling household. I realized my parents were only like this to try and protect me, but feeling so caged only made me want to venture out more, really. And this itch to be rebellious is what I think caused my lapse of judgment to agree to Sarah's plan that night. So it was a summer break between my junior and senior year of high school. Our mutual friend Riley, an amateur photographer, Sarah's boyfriend Ryan, and their friend Cherry, and myself were all sleeping over Sarah's house. Already a rare occurrence because of how strict my parents were. We were all chilling though on the couch, just watching Ghost Adventures, when Sarah was telling us about an episode that she was watching earlier, about this place called The Domes in Arizona. She was telling us how there was supposedly a satanic cult that practiced there, and how we should go and check it out. We live southeast of Phoenix, and would be able to get there in about 45 minutes. I looked at my phone's clock and saw that it was about 10 p.m. And this is where I should have objected, but I wanted to do something cool and adventurous, so I said yes. Everyone was excited and grabbed their supplies and piled into my crappy 2005 Golda Honda Accord. And to get to the domes, you need to drive in the middle of the desert, and anyone who lives in the desert knows just how creepy it can be at night. Maybe it was the dark, desolate highway, maybe it was the realization of what we were going to do, or maybe my guardian angel telling me that I'm a dumbass, but I started to just get really nervous about this trip. My thighs were shaking, and I just had this gut feeling that we should not be going to this place. I tried to voice my concerns as well, but everyone said that I was being paranoid and basically just told me to shut up and drive. We finally got off the highway, though, and drove on a dirt road for a few miles, until we pulled up to a chain-link fence with a gap in it. I pulled the car around so it was facing the exit, just in case we needed a speedy getaway. And as soon as I parked, Sarah, Cherry, and Ryan all jumped out and started walking through the fence. Riley hopped out too, but waited about 5 feet from the car for me so I wouldn't have to walk alone. I was hiding everyone's valuables because my car's locking mechanism was actually broken and all the locks need to be manually opened. Since I already had a bad feeling about this place, I opted to keep the doors unlocked, just in case we needed to all get in quickly. As I was hiding their stuff, I had the sudden urge to look to my left. Across the street was a tall line of hedges, and there appeared to be a man standing in the shadows just watching me. For some reason, this didn't immediately spark terror in me. Instead, I was just kind of curious and a bit confused. I was wondering if he actually lived around the area, or if it was just a human-shaped shadow or something. But I looked at this thing for about 3 seconds until I finished what I was doing and go out to join Riley. When I got to her, I asked, "Did you see that man?" Riley, confused, replied with, "What man? I didn't see anybody." So, in the end, I just kind of shrugged it off and we started walking. You needed to walk about 1/8 of a mile on dirt to get to the domes, and if you Google Grande Domes, pictures should come up, but I'll describe them anyways. So, there are multiple concrete domes in this center, and they vary in shape. I remember one that stood alone was UFO-shaped, while others were more circular and kind of connected. The domes appeared to be abandoned while they were still being built, and had been standing there for quite some time. They were made of concrete, were covered in graffiti, and most had chunks of the ceiling missing as the brutal Arizona sun had wore it down, so much in fact that they'd begun to fall apart. When Riley and I entered one of the domes, the first thing that I noticed was just how the structures manipulated the sound. Because of their shape, sound bounced really strangely inside. You could hear noises across the room like they were right next to you and could barely be able to hear the person right beside you. Also, it was the middle of the night in the desert. There's no light pollution out there, so the only lights that we had were the moon, our phone flashlights, and Riley's dad's police-style flashlight. And the combination of the shadows and the sounds were very disorientating, to say the least. So Riley and I were walking through these domes, chatting as she took photos until we caught up to the rest of the group. As we were walking, I could have sworn that I was hearing footsteps walking behind us on the dirt, and when we were rounding a corner, I looked back and I definitely saw a man tailing us. I saw this man multiple times throughout the night, in fact, and I would always ask Riley if she saw or heard anything too, but she always denied it and again told me that I was just being paranoid. The longer we stayed there, though, just the weirder things became. Others started hearing footsteps echoing outside, even if we were standing still. While we were in the center of the dome, we discovered a giant pentagram drawn on the floor with bones in the middle. I'm hoping that these were just someone's lunch leftovers from their edgy picnic or something, because I don't want to think that we were standing on the remnants of some satanic ritual. But while we were looking at the pentagram, we started hearing scratching on the walls. Not short and rapid scratches like an animal digging, but really long, slow scratches like something or someone was trying to make its presence known. At this point, Ryan and I were asking to leave because it was definitely getting to be a bit too freaky. But then, in the middle of us protesting, Cherry's face became expressionless, and she slowly turned around and started walking towards the back of the room to what appeared to be either an exit or entrance of another room with a pony wall between us and it. As Cherry was walking in this trance-like state, Sarah was saying to her, "Don't go in there. Cherry, someone is following you. I'm telling you, don't go in there, you'll regret it," etc. But we all watched as she turned the corner and walked out of our view. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like we were waiting there for at least 5 minutes in anticipation, and then we all heard Cherry let out a blood-curdling scream and run straight back to us. She started telling us how she needed to leave now and she didn't want to be there anymore. I thought for a moment that she was just pulling a prank on us, but the look of fear in her eyes and the trembling in her voice seemed just too genuine for that. Finally, though, everyone agreed to start walking back to the car. When we were within visuals of the car, Sarah suddenly stopped and asked me to look at her back as she lifted her shirt up. And she had 3 long red scratch marks running down the length of her back. I said to her, "Holy crap, you have scratches. Does it hurt?" And Sarah was like, "Yeah, it burns." "What? I have scratches?" I started to reply to her when she interrupted me by screaming, "Run." "You don't have to tell me twice." We all start running towards my car, and as soon as I got in it, I started the car and asked if everyone was in, and they frantically said yes, drive now. So I started to floor it when I heard one of them say, "Wait, Cherry's not here." I immediately stopped and backed up to find Cherry throwing a tantrum in the middle of the street. She yells at me, "No, it's cool, I'll stay here," and sits down in the middle of the street. I began to apologize and tell her to just get in the car, but she ignored me and just continued throwing a fit, yelling about how she wants to stay there and die and generally just being dramatic. I never did really like Cherry, and while I did feel bad about almost leaving her there like that, her throwing a tantrum was really starting to piss me off, and I was thinking about actually leaving her ass there for being a brat. But before I could, Sarah managed to convince her to get into the car and we began to drive off. We were about a quarter mile of the way when I saw a flashlight flickering on and off in the rearview mirror. I stopped and asked the rest of them if they saw that too. They said that they did, and Sarah wanted me to turn around and see what it was. I refused and said that I wouldn't drive us back over there, and to that Sarah replied with, "Okay then, I'll drive." In my 16-year-old brain, I thought that was a great idea, and so we switched seats and she turned around. The lights appeared to be in the same location as the opening in the fence, but as we passed, we didn't see anything. We continued to drive about another quarter mile until we saw the flashing light in the rearview mirror again. So she turned around and again we didn't see anything when we passed. We repeated this 2 more times until I told her that I was fed up and that someone was probably just messing with us. And so we decided that we should just leave. But as we passed the entrance, she slammed the brakes and she rolled down her window, and in the shadow of the hedges, there was a man standing there just staring at us. The light from our phones were too dim to reach him, and I was asking Riley to hand me her police flashlight, but she was frozen in fear and I couldn't reach it. Sarah and Cherry were yelling at him, asking, "Hey, who are you? Were you the one with the flashlight?" And then, when he wouldn't answer, Cherry started to get aggressive with him. She started saying, "Hey, you freak, we're talking to you. What's your deal?" And this next part still gives me shivers to this day. The man then took a step forward into the light so that we could see him, and in that moment, we all collectively realized what he was wearing. He had on a black cloak with a hood up, and as he took another step forward, he raised his arms up to his side in a way that resembled Jesus Christ on the cross, and in the most monotone but sinister voice said, "Don't worry guys, it's just me," and smiled. As he said this, I was drawn to a reflection of light, because he was holding a knife in his left hand. I immediately started yelling at Sarah to drive, and he started sprinting towards the car. She floored it, and as she did, in the rearview mirror, we saw about 10 people run out of the hedges and the fence line towards our car. We were all looking back, screaming our heads off, and when we turned onto the highway, we all eventually calmed down, but after that, nobody spoke. When we reached the nearest gas station, Sarah asked to switch, and I drove the rest of the way back to her house. Sarah and Cherry went to sleep upstairs in their bedroom. Cherry had actually been kicked out of her house and was temporarily living with Sarah, and they shared a room and the bed in the room as well. Ryan and Riley and I slept on the big L-shaped couch downstairs in the living room, and I was obviously still spooked, but said a prayer, and eventually I just fell asleep. And the next day, when I went home, everything was normal. About a week later, though, I got a text from Sarah to meet up. She had dropped out of school the previous semester to get a GED instead, and since I was in AP classes, it wasn't uncommon for me to not see her all week. That evening, she came over to my house, and she just looked awful. Her hair was greasy, her eyes looked tired and bloodshot, and I knew immediately that something was up. I brought her up to my room and asked her what was wrong, and she immediately started crying and told me about the past week. She said that night of the Domes adventure, and every night since then, she's had this same nightmare. She's looking down at herself sleeping from the corner of the bedroom ceiling when this demon begins to crawl out of her closet. Apparently, it has the head of a ram, but the body of a man with no genitalia. It crawls toward her bed, and it moves as if every bone in its body is kind of broken. She's filled with absolute dread as all she can do is watch. It climbs onto her bed and breathes heavily over her unconscious body, and at this point, she's so terrified that a single tear drops down onto the beast. The exact moment that the tear makes contact with this creature, its head turns 180 degrees, and it makes eye contact with her. And then she immediately wakes up from the dream and begins sobbing. It even got to the point where she was trying to pull an all-nighter, but always ended up passing out from exhaustion. And that morning, she had begun to share her experiences with Cherry, when Cherry began to shake and cry as well. Sarah was confused, until Cherry said, "I've been having that exact same dream every night too." After that, everything seemed to settle down, and we eventually lost contact, but I'll never forget that night at the Domes and everything that happened. This happened to me over a decade ago, but I'll never forget the feeling deep in my chest, both that night and the next morning when the true nature of the situation became apparent. So it was late December in a small Texas town. We had just received 5 inches of snow earlier in the day. I can't remember what time it was, and all I remember was it was dark out. I was playing in my room though, and it's important to note that my room was made up of 2 rooms. My mudroom with a door leading out to the front, then my actual bedroom. The door was an old-style wood door with all the old hardware and had a window on the top half. It had a window shade, but that wouldn't stop anyone from looking in if they wanted. My room was the frontmost, with my parents' room being in the back of the house as well. So I was in my mudroom playing with my Hot Wheels when I felt something weird, like someone was watching me. I was trying to focus on the little openings left by the window shade. I stared, looking for any reason to feel unsafe and run, but after a while I was sure that there was nothing, so I went back to playing. A few minutes later, I got that feeling again though, and this time I didn't look at the door, but instead moved to where my back was now at the door, and I was just hoping that it was all in my head. Just then, the most terrifying thing happened. There was a noise at the door, like the doorknob was being touched. I was still turned around, back facing the door. I was completely frozen at the metal-on-metal sound of the doorknob. It was definitely moving. I didn't know how or why, but it was moving, slowly turning, testing the lock. I wanted to move, but I was frozen. It was honestly like someone just glued every joint in my body. My chest felt like a car was parked on it. My parents had been in their shower all the way at the back of the house, leaving me at the front all alone, with the only room lit up being mine. Suddenly, the doorknob was not being gently moved, and someone was turning it with force now. This door was one that had been locked with a skeleton key, so the knob could turn and open freely. Luckily, there were 2 deadbolts, and whoever was on the other side just figured out that the knob was free to open. As soon as I heard the knob turn all the way, I sprung up to the wall about 5 feet from the door, my back to the wall. The door fell silent, and I found myself glued on the wall, unable to move. Then the knob turned slowly, and I remember watching, just waiting for it to turn all the way. When it did, Whoever was on the other side started to try and budge the door and pry it open, and at first it was easy going, but then they started pounding into the door with their foot, and they got only 2 kicks in when I unfroze and screamed for my life. I sprinted to the back of the house to get my parents. They asked what was wrong, and I told them that someone was trying to break in. They immediately ran and checked, not bothering to look outside, which I pleaded them to go and check outside, and they just said that my imagination was running wild and it must have been an animal or the old age of the house. They took one final look at my mudroom, not bothering to investigate any further, and then I was just told to go to bed. It took me hours, and I don't even remember falling asleep. All I remember is staring at the door from my bed, never taking my eyes off the doorknob. Suddenly, though, I was woken up by my parents, who were obviously distressed and seemed to be scared. My mum grabbed me by both shoulders and got right in front of me. She asked very sternly why I thought someone tried to break in. When I told them this time, they actually seemed to listen. I was really worried how serious they were as they asked me about everything. When I was done, they said that they have to go show me something, and they took me to the front door and out to the front yard, and pointed to my door near the driveway. And when I looked, you could clearly see boot prints in the snow, walking along the street through our yard and straight to my window, then my mudroom door, where I'd been playing the night prior. The police showed up and took a report, but nothing ever really came from it, and I was never able to sleep well in that house again. I can never forget what it felt like as a child to go through this and to not have my parents believe me like that. I'm just glad that I wasn't home alone, and very thankful for those deadbolts. When I was a senior in high school, I babysat for a family friend of ours, and I normally didn't babysit their kid, but their usual sitter cancelled last minute, so I thought why not. The baby, he was 1 or 2 years old, and around 9 p.m. I put him into bed upstairs in his crib. I watched TV downstairs in the living room with a baby monitor next to me, and after a couple of hours I hear the baby screaming, and it was like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It didn't sound like a normal baby crying, and his shriek conveyed a sense of terror so far removed from an infant's normal emotional spectrum that I just instantly panicked. I rushed upstairs to check on the kid. I opened the door to find him standing in his crib, holding himself up with one hand and his other hand pointing at the closet. I gathered my courage and I opened the closet, and when I did, there was nothing there. Since his parents would be home soon, I decided to comfort him on the couch downstairs. 10 or 15 minutes later, the parents arrived. Immediately, they were rightfully a little put off, wondering why the baby wasn't in bed. I explained what happened, clearly still a little bit freaked out. And the mother became visibly distraught, flew upstairs without a word, and the father solemnly apologized to me, then asked for my discretion, to which I agreed. He then told me that his wife had been seeing the ghost of a Civil War soldier standing at the foot of their bed. He paid me a little bit too generously, and after that I just went home. The memory of that kid's shriek still sends a chill up my spine. Although I didn't see anything, I think my experience validated what the mother had been seeing, for her at least, I think. I'm not sure the husband believed her, or whether that night changed his opinion or anything. At the very least, I got the vibe that they disagreed about it. But after that, I never babysat for them again. My dad works for a contracting company in St. Louis, Missouri. The building's interior is exactly the same as it was in the 1960s, all except for the dust and deterioration. But the actual date of construction is 1910. It's only a 5-story tall building, by the way, and it's nothing immensely big. It was previously used as a law firm, but when the firm left, they decided not to take anything with them. There was tons of law books and paintings and desks and everything. But the basement, back in the 1960s, they started to renovate it, but it was just never finished. The basement is an extremely dilapidated 1910s, paint falling off, broken glass-ridden, rusting freight elevator, deadly tetanus-infested nail cesspit. But me and my dad went in there anyway. Also, keep this in mind. My dad coaches boxing as a hobby, and he's huge, all muscle pretty much, and he's fought all of his life, and even he was scared of this basement. Now, every time that we go down there, something is different. The first time I remember going down there, the plaster on the walls of a hallway had just fallen off, and I mean all of it. The whole hallway was just stripped down to its bare structure. I assumed it was because of the renovation, but my dad said, "What the heck is all this stuff? This wasn't here before." So we go down the hallway, and yeah, sure, in and of itself it could be explained away, but there was this metal chair in the middle of the dark hallway, and for whatever reason, it really freaked me out. My dad turned on the lights, and they worked for a second, but then they all bursted and fizzled out, and it was probably because of how old they were. Also, down the hall there was this boiler room in which contained a rubberized trench coat, rubberized to avoid stains, and also a bowling ball bag. Inside the bowling ball bag was a cleaver with what I assume was a deer bone handle or something. Whatever the case, after that we decided to leave. A few weeks later we came back down and all the plaster on the floor was completely gone. We went to the end of the hallway and the boiler room door was closed. Maybe we closed it. I don't remember doing that at all though, and it doesn't seem like our priority was to close the door when we left, so it wouldn't make much sense. Now, no one has a key to the building except my dad, and me and him are the only ones to enter the building, ever. And at the time, there was a T-shaped intersection, and on the wall there were these 3 identical pictures of the same exact African-American priest with a deadpan expression. His eyes were glazed over like he was blind or something, and we came back after a few months, near Christmas, and we'd only made it down the steps and immediately left because there was a Christmas tree with little lights blinking and a Santa Claus doll with the most indescribably creepy grin that I've ever seen in my life down in that basement. So we were living in a bad part of town, and, well, it wasn't completely horrible, but you always locked your car doors, car trunk, pretty much anything with a lock. This night was like any other night. We were watching TV, and both of us were playing on our PCs in the living room. We're huge gaming nerds, and our PCs are always in the living room. At this time, our cat Bleach Spot, nicknamed because she had one white spot on the top of her head, was sitting in the kitchen window crying, which was odd because she didn't cry very much. My husband proceeded to get up and go check things out, and we see a foot. Yeah, a foot in our kitchen window. My husband opens the window and asks the guy why he's standing in our kitchen window, and this guy was a Hispanic guy who apparently lived in the apartment above ours, got locked out somehow, explanation coming, and was trying to crawl up the outside of the building back into their apartment. He told this guy to get his ass down from there before he breaks his neck, and the guy tells my husband okay and proceeds to climb down. He also had to climb down because my husband was hanging onto his foot as well. He was not about to let this guy climb up the outside of the wall. Now, just think for a second. These were 2-story apartments, and he was almost to the 2nd story, so I'm guessing that he was already 8 feet in the air. How he thought that he was going to be able to climb up there is beyond any rational thoughts that I can put together. But while the guy was climbing back down, my husband gets on the phone and calls 911. It just didn't look right, and I mean, clearly it didn't look right for him to be climbing up there. I mean, if he was locked out for a good reason, you would call the landlord or the maintenance man to come let you back into your apartment, right? Our landlord lived on the premises along with the maintenance man as well, so we knew that something fishy was going on here. So we called 911, explained that this guy was climbing up the outside of the building trying to get to the top apartment, and they said that they would send someone out. This guy comes around to the front of the apartment building, goes upstairs and proceeds to beat on the door for about 15 minutes straight. My husband even opened the door and hollered upstairs and told him to knock it off, that it was getting too late. It was around 1 a.m. at this time, and he was still beating on the door when the cops arrived to find out what's going on or arrest him, or whatever they plan to do here. The cop goes upstairs and tells him to stop beating on the door and to come downstairs so that they could talk and settle some things. Well, this guy didn't like the cop apparently, so somehow in an enclosed breezeway, he gets away from the cop and runs off. And the next thing I know, I find out why this guy was climbing up our window and upstairs, beating the door down. A lady cop came to our door and wanted to come inside to talk to us, and she told us this guy was kicked out by his girlfriend. He was illegally in the US, and the reason she wasn't up there, well, her and her mother both were in hospital because he had beaten the both of them black and blue with a baseball bat. His girlfriend wanted to break up with him, and when she did, he got mad and almost beat them both to death. Apparently, he did all this before he'd gotten home that evening and while we were at my husband's mother's house. So, when we got home, the commotion was already over and no one had told us a thing. The female cop, who, by the way, was about 6'2", I would not want to mess with her, told us to make sure that we lock our windows and keep the front door locked. They were going to have a cop car with a spotlight all night long checking over the apartment complex and basically in the area where these apartments were located. She told us to consider this guy very dangerous and to not try to apprehend him ourselves. But we agreed with her and she gave us her car and told us good night. The next day, the sweet lady who lives across the hall from us came over to let us in on some more information. Apparently, they did find the guy, but he was never caught because he got away from them again. The mother and the daughter were all well, and his ex-girlfriend was stable but still in bad shape, but they would make it. It's pretty scary to think that this guy would make so much effort to get to these women again, and it's also pretty scary to think of what may have become of us if we had antagonized him. For the first 6 years of my life, I lived in a low-income townhouse in Indiana with my mum and my older sister. My dad lived with us for a couple of years before my parents were divorced, and for years I've just carried with me an experience that I had one night. So I was about 5 and I'd been ill, so naturally I was given medicine and sent to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night with my sister laying next to me, and my eyes adjusted, like coming into the room from the hallway. Across from the door was the window facing the back, which was the front of the back row of the houses. And it was then that I realized with sudden surprise and fright that there was someone sitting on the top of my chest of drawers. They were perched on the back of the edge of the drawers and behind the curtain and appeared to be staring at the window. I couldn't see their features wrapped in the curtain, which still hung from its rod, and the figure just didn't move. I laid there for a moment, staring, expecting them to look at me, and after a moment I had the intense urge to pee, so I built up my courage, climbed over my sister, and bolted to the bathroom, which is at the other end of the hall, next to my mother's bedroom. I went in, quickly closing the door, and used the toilet. After finishing, I opened the door and peeked around the corner, and the figure was still there, behind the curtain, unmoving. I built my courage again, and I ran back into my room, grabbed my blanket, and abandoned my sleeping sister to go into my mother's room. If the figure ever did move, I didn't see it. But once in my mum's room, I was instructed to lay on the floor next to the bed. I was terrified of this too, because the dark underside of my mother's bed was right there, almost taunting me. But thankfully, nothing happened, and I eventually just fell back to sleep. And I never saw the figure from my bedroom again. That I know of at least. Now, a few years ago, for one reason or another, my dad told me a story about this house as well. One late night in '92, when I was just a kid, he was downstairs playing video games, and he then heard the sliding glass door in the kitchen open, then close, followed by the sound of heavy booted footsteps. Now, he knew that one of his younger brothers wore boots and thought that it was him stopping by. He keeps playing his games as the footsteps crossed the kitchen into the living room and stopped behind him. Without turning, he says, "Hey Jerry, what's up?" And there's no response. After a pause, my dad turned around and there was no one there. I mentioned this to my mum recently, and she told me I remember the sliding door incident, and I asked her what she experienced there, and she told me that she heard people walking around, cabinets opening, and the worst part, my doll talking when no one was around to make it speak. And it just kept saying "mama" over and over again, and in my mother's words, she threw that terrible piece of crap away. I've been afraid of dolls for what feels like all my life, and I guess I know why now. She also said that she remembered your window visitor, and while I was talking to my mum, I was also texting my dad about his experiences aside from the boots, and he told me that once he saw shadows wandering around the field across the way from our home, like they were lost and searching or something. Nowadays, there's more developments where the field used to be, and I expect that they're just as haunted as our place was. He corroborated the cabinets opening and closing as well, and added that the toilet would flush on its own sometimes too. His other brother, my Uncle Ed, who's passed away since then, would feel them, according to him, all the time, and my dad always sensed that they were being watched. One of his friends also had an experience, falling asleep in a chair, only to wake up to find a dog growling at him, but we didn't have a dog. Considering all of this, I'm convinced that I've had more than one experience in that house, but whether I blocked it out or I forgot because of the brain damage done by a neurological disorder I have, I'm not too sure. I'm quite happy not remembering anything else though, because the window visitor has been enough to bother me all these years. For necessary context, I was transitioning over from part-time retail hours to a full-time third-shift job, and I also had a week to alter my sleeping schedule accordingly. And nearly every day, I failed. I would lay down just to rest my eyes and would always end up falling asleep. You'd think I'd learn after the first few times, but no. Unfortunately, too, I only had a day left at this point. I knew if I didn't succeed this last night that I'd be in for a world of tired when I began the job. But again, I laid down to rest my eyes halfway through the night like an idiot when I got a little bit tired, and I wasn't exhausted or anything. I was already a bit of a night owl at this point. But before I could even relax or close my eyes, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Now, our house is 140 plus years old, so every time someone moved in it, you could definitely hear them. But there was one problem. My father was at work, and my mother was at a schooling convention in another state, and my brother was at a Boy Scouts camp. So there wasn't supposed to be anybody in the house but me. I was very, very alert now, and petrified, and despite an army's worth of bladed weapons in my room, I chose to play possum, feigning sleep. I hoped that whoever it was would just take what they wanted and leave me be. Sure, I have weapons, but I'm a very small girl and could be easily overpowered. Stupid now that I think about it, but well, that's what happened. So, with closed eyes, I heard my bedroom door pushed open and then footsteps creaking across the floor directly towards my bed. I thought, oh great, so this is how I'm about to die, as I could just feel someone leaning over me and breathing on the back of my neck. Oddly though, the breath was neither cold nor warm. And then a voice said, "Do you think you should be really doing that?" And what I clearly heard was a patronizing, unfamiliar man's voice behind my head. And then it was just silence. I sat up slowly after a few moments, so as not to bash my head on whoever was with me at this point, and there was nobody there, and nothing. And my bedroom door was closed, and a quick search of the house revealed nothing, and I had first questioned if it was perhaps sleep paralysis, which is often accompanied by hallucinations, but I'm very, very confident that it wasn't. On the bright side, I was definitely not tired anymore and stayed up the whole rest of the night, and the job turned out to be hell in terms of energy sapping. I don't know if I would have made it through the first day without getting the sleep I needed at the right time. So, in the end, I guess I should say thank you to whoever or whatever that was. This happened when I was 12. So, I was babysitting for a family with 2 little girls, and I babysat for them fairly frequently, and they lived around the corner. But the father was weird and kind of intense, would ask me to do weird things like be a bartender at a party that they were throwing, or encourage me to try on his wife's clothing and play dress-up, and he asked personal questions about my boyfriends and what I did with them. I didn't have any boyfriends, mind you, and the wife was just never around for these interactions. One night I was babysitting, and after putting the girls to bed, I started hearing weird sounds from upstairs. I was about to call my dad to come and investigate for me when the father came down the stairs wearing nothing but his tidy whities. he had been there the whole time just waiting for his girls to go to bed. I jumped up and ran for the door, and he called after me that he hadn't been feeling good, so he stayed home and that he would pay me, and I just left and booked it home. I was weirdly embarrassed, so I didn't tell my parents, and I just decided that I'd never babysit for them again. But after that, my mum started getting really weird phone calls while I was at school, someone just breathing into the phone or asking if I was home. This was before cell phones and caller ID, mid-90s, and that culminated with her getting a phone call where a man told my mother that he was going to get me and detailed exactly what he was planning on doing to me. But my mum never told me exactly what he said, but it was bad enough that she called the police. The police were able to track the number to the creepy father, and I didn't know what was happening until the cops showed up to my school to escort me home, because the creepy father, apparently, wasn't home. And he was outside my school, waiting for me. I was 15 when it happened. Single boy, parents worked abroad, had the whole house to myself at night, but occasionally had help by day, and high school had gotten tougher because I just experienced one of my worst heartbreaks ever, and every day was just really glum at the start of the third quarter. Day in and day out, I'd come home from school to a large empty house, 5 bedrooms, depressed, and some nights I'd just cry myself to sleep. Time passed though, and it was a week or two before finals. I was knee-deep in my studies, but time didn't really do much with the pain, since basically the reason for my heartache attended the same class as me. Yes, I know, but I was young, and I fell asleep once again with tears. I woke up later that night and went straight to the bathroom. My room had a large glass window, which is around 2 by 3 meters big. Perpendicular to the window was my study table that was stationed by the wall. I walked past this to get to the bathroom, and while I took a leak, I heard a loud explosion come from the room. It sounded like a firework going off, so I hurried up, finished my business, and ran back to inspect what had happened. And nothing. Everything was fine. I glanced to the right to check if maybe the sound came from outside, but the window was closed, and had a firework from outside gone off? It should have sounded muffled, though, and it didn't. It was crisp and loud as hell. My computer was unplugged, and there was no smell of smoke, so my PSU or AVR exploding wasn't a possibility, and I just shook my head and thought that it was nothing. I got back onto the bed, and the moment my back hit the comforter, I felt multiple stabbing sensations on my back. I jumped out of panic and pulled my comforter up, and I saw just so many ball pens on my bed. There was a small mound of them with no caps on them. I was just really confused. How could there be ball pens there? No one could have placed them there while I was peeing. I mean, my house and yard were locked down and surrounded by 4-meter walls with spikes on the top. With some hesitation, I took the pens and placed them on my side table. Due note, too, is that my bed was beside my table. So I finished moving them, and I was still stunned. It took me a moment to realize that while I was sitting on my bed thinking, the air felt much colder, and I just felt uneasy. I decided maybe I was just not feeling well from all the crying, and so I just went back to sleep. But this time, I was sleeping on my right, facing away from the window and the table. Do you guys remember the sound that Windows XP makes when you turn on your PC? Well, I heard that familiar tune ring from my speakers a moment after I laid down. The weirdest thing, too, is that I knew my computer was unplugged. Yet, I could see from how much brighter the room got because the monitor was on and that blue light Windows has on its logon screen that it indeed was on. But not only that, I felt this insane cold spot on my feet. I wasn't looking anywhere at this point. I just kept my eyes straight at my wardrobe. The room was already cold, but my feet just felt like something freezing was touching them. I tried to turn my head a little, and from my peripheral vision, I saw it. I couldn't see all of it, but it was tall, faint, and white. And worst of all, I knew it was staring at me, even if I couldn't see whatever face it had. I bolted out of my room and ran all the way to my parents' room. It was on the other end of the house, and I just sat there on their bed just panicking. I mean, what the hell just happened? Well, what the hell was that? I felt safe there because it was full of rosaries and a figurine of Jesus. years, when out of nowhere I heard faint and slow kind of knocks, the type you hear in movies from wooden walls. And one after the other, the knocks grew louder and louder until they stopped and the door swung open. I couldn't see anything or anyone, but I felt like someone was just staring at me. I turned on all the lights and the TV, and I just sat on the very back of the bed. But nothing happened, and I just stayed like that until morning. I went back to my room when the clock outside sang its 6 a.m. song, and the computer, it wasn't unplugged anymore. My speakers were, though, which was weird because my speakers were the only thing plugged in before. At this point, I knew something wrong happened last night, but I had to get ready for school, so I just went to the bathroom. But the moment I enter, I see my toothbrush just sitting in the middle of the bathroom. This freaked me out, and so I decided to use my parents' shower instead, only going to grab my clothes. I got to school and told my friends, but I ended up just getting laughed at. I got home, usual 5 p.m, and I tried to go about the rest of the day like normal. I thought perhaps I was just hallucinating a little bit from being alone for so long or something. So I fell asleep and I woke up to the same freezing feeling, and I knew then that someone was looking at me. I knew, and I could just tell, and the worst part of it was that I read my clock when I ran out of the room, and it was 3 a.m. And this just kept happening every night, but I realized something. I would only wake up at 3 a.m. when I slept in my room. Whenever I would sleep in my parents' room, I was completely fine. Woke up the usual 5:30. No cold, no scary feeling, nothing. And so I decided to spend the remainder of the school year not sleeping in my room. Summer came and I travelled to my sister's house, which was 2 cities away. Spent 2/3 of my summer months just trying to forget my heartache, but most of all my room, and went home and tried to sleep in my room on the first night back, but it was to no avail. I still woke up at 3, but this time I was actually having difficulty breathing. The next day, I tried to walk around the neighbourhood to look for answers, passed by one of the houses and saw one of my mum's friends, along with others, hanging out by their porch, told them what happened, and most of them were just speechless, except for 2 of them, and they told me this. They asked me, were you incredibly angry or bothered or sad these past months? And I answered yes, and told them that I was still nurturing a heartache. One of them nodded at me and continued and said, then something followed you home. It must have been attracted to your negative energy like a cloud around you. Your room must have been drenched in all that sadness, and so it stayed there and made its lair there. And this honestly really scared me. I wasn't one to believe much in folklore, but with what was happening, I kind of thought that maybe she was right. And so I went home as fast as I could and started planning. I went to the nearest computer cafe to read up about cleansing, and I decided to use holy water and prayer. On one Saturday, I went to a local parish with a bottle, tried to take water from one of the stone basins with holy water when a priest stopped me and asked what I was doing. He found it funny that someone who wasn't a regular, yes, I am Catholic, was getting holy water. So I ended up just telling him everything. And his expression turned grim. He tried to stop me from my plan, but couldn't because I just wouldn't listen, so he left, but not without parting me with these words. He said, you must be very careful with that. You don't know who, or worse, what you're dealing with. But I didn't care. I was ready to fight this thing because I was sick of it. So I got home and entered the room. I opened the bottle and immediately splashed it around, first targeting the window, and it felt like a dream or a nightmare, but as soon as I swung the first time and water came out, I felt cold. Not the normal cold, but I felt like I was frozen. And I felt someone standing behind me, and I heard this just ungodly gurgling scream. It was both high-pitched and low in unison, and then I felt as if every hair on my body became frozen, and at the same time as if someone pulled at them with so much force that it was excruciatingly painful. I felt like my skin was kind of coming undone from me, and the door slammed shut on its own as I ran out, and I ran to my parents' room, grabbed their keys and some money, and I took 2 buses back to my sister's place. I got there, unnerved and crying, and my skin was red like I just had this really bad rash all over me. People thought that I had lost my mind at this point, and my sister was worried sick and thought that I was on drugs or something. She immediately called my mum, and we talked on the phone, and they both agreed to let me stay there up until a week before summer ended. I took every moment that I could to regather myself, and I just couldn't sleep properly though for the first few days. At the end of it all, I went back home and was accompanied by our house help when we opened the house, and we went straight from my mum's room and tried to open it, but it was shut. We tried for a moment to get this door open, but it kind of wouldn't budge, but finally we got the door open and we swung it. And when we looked inside, it was a complete mess. Everything was just covered in linen, and there were mushrooms on my bed legs and wardrobes, and the bed sheets looked damp, and I took a step and immediately I just felt extremely cold. The help that I had even said that she felt a strange presence, and there was a crack on the window close to where I sprayed the holy water. And well, we immediately backed out, locked the room, and called my parents over the phone. My mum said that she'll have my room renovated immediately, and I was allowed to use my parents' room from now on. Time passed and people began tearing out my room, and the construction workers said that they would also feel strange or feel cold in there. 2 got into an accident while placing in a new floor, and a few noted that they saw someone standing in the room at night. They would sometimes work late while I was home. And after that, I just never slept there again, ever. The room was locked shut, and I moved out years later for college, and I got a chance to fly home months back, and it was locked for about 10 years. I undid the locks, and I re-entered it, and nothing. It was like whatever was in there was just gone. But I remember every day what it felt like. I couldn't recognize my room anymore, in fact, and there was a large painting of Jesus placed in front of my door and some rosaries. And apart from that and the renovations, nothing else was ever done to that room. And well, after I looked at it for a little bit, I just locked it once again, and then I left. And I dared not sleep in it ever again. My parents don't allow anyone to open it, and not even the help is allowed in there, and to this day, it's kept tightly locked shut. So, it was late on Thursday night, well after midnight, and I was up finishing up an assignment. I was flipping between my assignment and chatting to some friends on MSN Messenger. Those were the days, right guys? And I heard someone outside talking to our dogs like they knew them. We had a border collie and a cattle dog, both super protective, and I thought to myself, who would be coming into my house at 12 o'clock at night? And then the penny dropped. I quickly sent off a message to a friend that I was chatting to, saying, I think someone's trying to break into my house. Now, I live in a small town, and the house that this happened in was at the very top of a ridiculously steep hill. We never got foot traffic because of just how awful it was to walk up. We never locked the back door, and in summer, which it was at this point, we just left it open to catch the breeze. Plus, with the 2 dogs, no one was ever game to try and get in anyway. So I've just sent the message off, and I hear the familiar creak of the gate swinging open, and then the click of it shutting, and footsteps walking in through the laundry. And at this point, my blood runs cold. I'm stuck in my chair trying to figure out what I'm about to meet, and the footsteps get closer, and there's this really large man slumping up against the doorframe. I think that he's potentially drunk or something. I wasn't sure, and I blurt out at him, "Who the hell are you?" He starts using the furniture to walk closer to me as he isn't very steady. How the hell he got up the hill and up the concrete stairs and to this point is beyond me. But I say, "What the hell are you doing in my house?" trying not to panic. Thankfully, the furniture ends before he can get to me. He walks backwards and he sits down on the couch. He mumbles to me over and over, "I'm just going to sit down here," and I'm trying to figure out what the heck to do next. My phone isn't close by, and my parents are asleep up the hallway, and I have to walk near him to get there. My younger sister is in the room closest to him, asleep, and no one knows what's happening. I'm not game to turn my back on him and message my friend again, and I'm also dressed in just underwear and a tank top, no bra. I stand up and say, I'm just going to go to bed now, and as I stand up, he realizes how I'm dressed. He also stands up and says, "My, you look good, don't you?" and starts to get closer. And it was at this point that I bolted through to the kitchen, up the hallway, and fling myself on top of my dad, yelling about the drunk in the house. I don't think I've ever run so fast or screamed that loud, and my parents finally register what's happening. Dad gets up, and this man is halfway up the hallway, having followed me, and now, my father is very tall, and he's a really hairy guy. He also had a penchant for dyeing his hair and moustache and chest hair purple, and he was sleeping in only his underwear. So, this creepy, somewhat drunk or high or something guy now has a tall, angry, hairy, mostly naked purple man yelling to get out of his house. And at this point, he sprints out of the house and down the hill. And at this point, he sprints out of the house and straight down the hill. My mum was on the phone to the police, and our next-door neighbours had heard my dad roaring, and they also called the cops, and my best friend lived in that house, and she came out and comforted me. Her dad, who was over 6 foot and built like a brick house, came over and sat in the front yard until the cops turned up. 4 cops arrived. It must have been a slow night. 2 marked cars, undercover detectives, and the dog squad, and my street looked like a disco party at this point. They eventually caught him, and he was charged with drunk and disorderly and trespassing or something, and I saw my friend, the one I'd messaged the next day, and explained everything. He thought that I was joking at the time, which is good to know because if there's a next time, I'm not going to message him. To this day, though, I'm not sold on him being truly drunk or intoxicated. It was a Thursday, and he seemed too coherent in places, and being able to get where he was, you couldn't do that plastered. Also, having the ability to talk the dogs down like that was a bit strange. But we didn't live near any pubs, and so he had to live nearby, and I would walk to school every day, so maybe he'd seen me then. And it wasn't long after that someone in our neighbourhood had found out that a pedophile had been relocated to our neighbourhood. So, who knows? Was it him, or was it just a rumour? I've never forgotten that night, or the fear even, and there's always the what-ifs, like if I'd been the only one home, or what if he'd gotten a hold of me. It always makes me shudder. So this is not the classic type of creepy story that you've heard before, but rather about a person with a narcissistic personality out to ruin his colleagues' lives, especially mine. But this was my first job while studying psychology at university, so literally every living moment that I was not at university, I was at work. I worked as an AV technician in a bank, and at this point I had been there for 2.5 years. But we had a position to fill within the team, and interviewed a man named Sam. And he came across really well in the interview. Polite, kind, intelligent, and just everything we wanted in a new employee. He had mentioned during his interview that he needed 3 days off within the next 2 weeks as he had a funeral for his partner who had just passed away. But we were completely understanding, and he was hired and started a week later. I was put in charge of training the gentleman, which I greeted with pleasure as he was such a character to be around. He was an outgoing personality, and the way he came across instantly became a telltale sign that he was a homosexual. And sure enough, a few days after we knew him, he came out to us as well. None of us had a problem with it. It brought out some bubbliness to the office that we hadn't had in a while, in fact, and it instantly confirmed the use of the word partner rather than wife. A couple of us thought that it was weird that he trusted us enough so quickly to tell us something so personal, but oh well, there was no harm in it. I felt like we got on like a house on fire, and we were constantly chatting while training, and there were no signs to suggest that he didn't like me. That was until I was pulled into the office by my account manager, an assistant account manager, who then proceeded to tell me that he'd made a formal complaint about me. They proceed to explain that he thinks that I'm ignorant towards him and that, as his trainee supervisor, I should be more willing to assist him in his training with questions or any issues that he may have. There were silly things like not answering his calls when he needs help in a room and stuff like that, when actually, in reality, the only reason I never answered was because I was dealing with other users in other rooms, and I'm simply one person with one set of hands. But they basically said to try to make peace with him and just move on. So, here we are, a week into the new job. The new guy hates me, and I have a dissertation due in a week's time. This week was the week of his partner's funeral, and he was meant to be in on Monday and Friday. We had already agreed that Friday he would be in on an early shift in the main building, as I, with the other early shift technician, needed to go to the other building to deal with a VIP client. 30 minutes into the early shift, and I get a call from the reception of the main building saying that he hasn't turned up. I'm halfway across the city with no hope of getting back to the office anytime soon, and I've lost the plot on the phone to my team lead, who also didn't know he hadn't turned up. He never came in that day and caused just a ton of issues in our main building. He came back in on Monday morning and played the grieved husband card and that his mental health wasn't good enough to be in the office, to which I entirely sympathised. I'm sorry you lost your partner, and I know you needed the time to process what has happened, but all we wanted was a simple phone call so that we were not stuck in this. So Tuesday came and he was nowhere to be seen again. He phoned in sick, and that was pretty much that. We didn't hear from him again until the Friday morning, which was when he told us that he was still sick and would be back in on Monday. And this is where everything hit the fan. So, I'm on holiday the following week, which just leaves 2 technicians in the building, one early and one late, and he quits and files a formal complaint about the department to the manager director of the bank, and the list of accusations is phenomenal. Tech 1, stolen equipment which left him suspended indefinitely. Team lead, biased towards me, which meant as a new tech that he was piled with all the work. Account manager, biased towards me for being 2 of the only 3 females on the account. Rest of the team, basic crap like untidy uniforms, not willing to help, etc. Me though? Me? It was a whole other story. Untidy uniform, not wearing the correct shoes, constantly on their phone, playing games in the office, watching YouTube videos, ignorant to her work, not willing to train me as the new tech. He even had the balls to call me an alcoholic, drinking on the job. And not only was he full of crap, but he was jeopardizing my career at this point. And for what? Some attention? Well, I wasn't having any of it. I rallied the troops and we formed a united front, and literally everyone was on my side. At this point, bear in mind, I was a 22-year-old woman looking to find her feet and make a career for myself. And this went on for 6 full months. 6 whole months we spent being questioned, being investigated, and collecting evidence together to try and prove what he said was just complete crap. I was summoned by HR for questioning, and I was petrified. I answered all the questions, and so did my colleagues, and they found that he was essentially full of crap and just looking for some compensation. And, to my surprise, we Googled his name. And there he was, accused of stealing secrets from the police about the protection of the royal families on their formal outings, which he sold for £20,000. To this day, I don't even know if anything he said to me was true. But did his partner really die, or was he just pulling a fast one? I honestly have no clue. And I guess that's the creepy part about this story. We had no idea, and basically still have no idea, who this maniac was. Just for context, my boyfriend and I are homeless and we live in our car. There's a road that leads to a quiet beach on the bay near some train tracks, and there's only one road to exit, so not a lot of people come down this way, unless it's for beach access, people working in the industrial plants on the road, and none of which were open, going to an AA meeting, again none of which were open at the time, or if they're sleeping in their cars as well. Nothing in the area was open except maybe a couple of bars, and even those were a good 3 to 4 blocks away. Most of the stretch of road has 8-hour parking signs, so there are usually at least a few other people camped for the night, most of whom we've seen before, but tonight there just weren't as many. Just a few vehicles taking advantage of the overnight parking, so we parked a little further up the road than we normally do, hoping to get a better internet connection. So it was a little after 12:30 a.m. and we were just relaxing, watching YouTube with the dog, starting to get sleepy when we heard a car pull up behind us with their lights off. We cover our windows totally around so that no one can see in, but we can peek out if we move the blanket, and we can see the headlights from a car passing or approaching. And my boyfriend said it was a van, and we didn't think much of it and just kept trying to watch our show, annoyed with the spotty Wi-Fi connection. But there was a few words exchanged on what sounded like was the other side of the street, not behind us, when the van pulled up, and it sounded like there were maybe 3 or 4 people. A little bit later the van drove off, but then we heard a knock on my side of the window, the driver's side. We shut off the volume on the laptop and called out, "Yeah," but there was silence. So we called out, "Can we help you?" but again there was nothing. It was then that I realized that my door was actually unlocked, so I quickly locked it. After about 30 seconds of quiet, I pulled open the cover and no one was there. However, there are sometimes bums that walk around here, so they could have thought that we were someone else. It was silent for a while, and then we could see in the light of the street lamp, through the crack on the sun reflector covering the front shield, the silhouette of someone walking around the front of the car, slowly. It was another solid minute after we saw the movement before we heard a quieter tapping on the passenger side window. This time my boyfriend pulled the cover down almost right away, and again we didn't see who it was. Right after this, there was another knock on my side again, and it was right about now that we realized that there were more than 2 people out there. But there was no time for one person to get from the passenger side to my side between the second and the third knock, and we had heard more than one voice prior, so I started to think that maybe not everyone had gotten back inside the van before it drove off. So, after the third knock, I pulled my window cover down again, almost all the way, super annoyed and on edge by now. And there was a skinny white male, probably in his mid-30s to early 40s, holding a flashlight and something else scooped awkwardly in the other hand, almost like he was keeping it under his sweater, but we couldn't make it out. The windows were steamed up from us breathing inside with the window shut tight, so it was really difficult to see out, but he said, "Hey, I need a jump." That was interesting, since there are no stores nearby and no reason to be down here at 1 a.m, so we said, "Sorry, we're just about to take off, we're in a rush." He got frustrated and whined, "Come on, I've been down here for hours." Okay. If he'd been down here for hours, though, why did he not, A, ask us to help him about 45 minutes prior when we pulled up, parked, let our dog out to eat, go potty and all that, and get our bed set up? Or B, attempt to start the car at any point? We never heard a motor rev up, or an attempt to turn the engine, or even the jingling of keys or anything. Another reason this creeped me out is that I could only see him, and he said, "I need a jump. I've been down here for hours," when I could clearly hear that there were more than one person around. But we couldn't see them, and for one reason or another, they were standing out of view and not making themselves known. After this, though, he grumbled and went across the street to a white car with black rims that we had seen before, but not associated with him. And I just got this awful feeling in my gut, and even though all the windows were steamed up, I started the car and told my boyfriend to start wiping the windows so that I could see, and I just started driving. We could feel that there was just something sinister about the whole situation, and for one reason or another, they were trying to get us to open a door or a window. And when that didn't work, they didn't respond because they didn't have a good reason made up yet. So after a couple of attempts to get us to open the door, they gave us the sob story, hoping we would get out of the car so that they could either steal the car while we were trying to help them, get my boyfriend, either him directly or so that they could get to me, or they were going to rob us for the laptop, which I'm sure they could hear and see the glow of the screen. The possibilities at this point are unsettling and endless. Or maybe he was just a guy who happened to need a jump at 1 a.m, nowhere near any stores or houses, and I'm the jerk that left some poor guy down there on the side of the road, right? Well, we drove to McDonald's to eat something and parked in the back driveway of someone we knew so that we weren't right out in the open anymore. The lock on our trunk recently broke and is held together only with a bungee cord, with most of our belongings inside, so it worries me that it could make us an easier target for thieves. The next morning we were down there again, and the white car with the black rims was still there, only now the back window was busted out and the man was nowhere in sight. And in hindsight, I think it never was his car to begin with. I think all of those people came in the van and one of them drove off so that the rest of them could rob someone outright, or so that they could break into the parked cars on the side of the street when no one was in them. It was really stressful, and my boyfriend has been rattled for days. We were nervous to park in the same spot, so we're now looking to rent a residential driveway to park at night where we won't be so vulnerable. My boyfriend teased the dog for not barking, but I think it was very intuitive of him because if we needed to pretend that we weren't inside of the car, we would have been able to do so. Maybe it would have scared them right off, though. I'm not too sure. But I like knowing that he'll wait and watch me to know what to do in stressful situations. I'm just so relieved, though, that I was not down there by myself. Even the two of us together were pretty nervous, knowing that we were likely outnumbered, but if it were just a 120-pound female like myself in the car alone, I'm worried that they would have been a bit more aggressive about getting the door opened. Sometimes I think I watch too many murder investigation shows and conspiracy theory videos that make me paranoid. Maybe it's the fact that my grandfather was a homicide detective for 30 years in the same area, and I grew up with him constantly warning me of the dangers that lurk in the dark and what can happen to a person. He taught me that real monsters, they're not boogeymen. They are just plain men. This took place in 2007. I know that because I was in the 4th grade and I was 9 at the time. We live in a large neighborhood, and at that time it was surrounded by farmland. My house is a 1-story house, and when you stand in the doorway of my room, you can see the front door, the kitchen on the left, and my brother's room straight ahead. Turning your head to the left, you can see the living room and my parents' room, and you can get from my parents' room to the front door in less than a minute. Now, for a while, we'd been getting calls from jail. We had a phone that had a caller ID, and for 3 times a day for a week, our phone would call and the caller ID would say jail. We had no relations in jail at all, and so no police came to the house and there was nothing to it. We obviously never answered, and my mum always said that if they don't leave a voicemail, then it must not be important. They never left one, so we didn't answer, and we just assumed that maybe a person had a wrong number or something. But they always seemed to call in the morning and in the afternoon and evening. Well, one day we only got one call. We thought that was a bit weird, but we didn't care, and that night I was in bed just playing quietly because my sister, she was an infant at the time, was sleeping in my room. I remember playing with my Madeline doll, and I decided to go to bed, and it was around 9 or 10 p.m. at the time, I think, and I put my head on my pillow and the doorbell rang. Well, this was at a time that my dad would be getting home, so I thought it was my dad just playing with me. But the doorbell rang again and again and again, and I got scared and kind of clutched my doll and ran to my mum's room. She was awake and watching TV, and I told her someone was ringing the doorbell. She paused the TV, and the doorbell rang and just kept ringing. She immediately got my brother and sister, and the ringing then stopped. She looked through the peephole and saw a black figure of some sort, but couldn't make it out. Now, she did mention that she didn't know if it was a person or something else because she couldn't quite see it. She was too afraid to turn the porch light on, so she went back to her room, and the ringing continued, and then there was some knocking. It didn't sound like someone was trying to break in or anything, it just kind of sounded like casual ringing and knocking. But it just kept going, and then it went faster and more intense. And at this point, I got scared and cried, "Mummy, please make it stop." My mum called my dad to get home now, and he was 30 minutes away, and we endured intense ringing and knocking for what seemed like forever. And the longer we waited, the more vicious it sounded too. And then it just suddenly stopped. We sat in silence with the only light being the TV, and then we heard the garage open. My mum had this intense fear in her eyes as the garage went up, and she held my infant sister tightly and braced herself to protect us. And it was my dad. The strange thing is, though, is that my dad didn't see anything. His lights were on when he pulled into our street, but he drove slowly and he didn't see any car driving past him or anyone out there. My brother and I started to head back to our rooms when the ringing started again and we all froze. The ringing and the knocking continued viciously, and my dad ran towards the front door and swung it open, but no one was there. And there was nothing. My dad ran around the house too, but there was nothing. And after this, the calls from the jails just stopped. These days, we keep our porch light on now, and whenever the doorbell rings, I do get a bit nervous and keep quiet. I'm actually afraid that one day it might happen again. So I lived in a farm around 4 years ago, and from the moment that we moved there, I could tell that there was just something wrong. I felt uneasy in there, as if there was something constantly spying on me. Before I get into that, though, a little bit of detail about the place and the situation. So, we didn't technically own the place. It was borrowed from a woman that was trying to sell it. We call it a demo. So, we didn't have access to the house and slept on a wooden storage house. The farm itself was like this. There was a barbed wire gate that you manually had to move in the entrance, and in front of it was an open empty field with one of those outside washrooms to the right. Passing by it, there was a small group of trees and then the place where we slept. Passing that was the actual house to the left and then the forest. In the forest entrance, there was a tree with a ripped plastic bag tied to its branches, meaning that the bag was tied while it was still small, and people used it to do their mark or something. And right in front of it, there was a mound. Now, someone buried something in there, and I moved there with 4 dogs, plus the dog that already lived there that we took care of. Our routine was wake up at 5 a.m. to go to the city so I could go to school and my parents could go to work. Now, the first night we stayed there, I noticed my room was the only one in the entire house that didn't have a lock. I couldn't sleep because of the weird feeling that I had, and I stayed up all night and just slept on my way to school. But then, things got weirder. The door started opening at night, and I dismissed it as the wind, a cliche I know, but it became more frequent and more violent. Then, still at the first week, I saw it. It was a black humanoid figure with a white face. It was like the white face had empty eye sockets and, instead of a mouth, just an empty cavity on its face. And it stood at my door entrance, staring at me, and I decided that I wasn't going to sleep while I lived there. I couldn't bring myself to move or do anything at the time, so I just kept staring at it, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, some nights later, it became impossible to pretend because it started moving and doing things. It entered my room, tapped on my window. It was a metal window that was right beside my bed, slightly moved things, and kept being a general creep. Whenever I flashed my light on it too, it just disappeared, but the eerie feeling just kept there. I started keeping a flashlight in my room and playing music to keep myself awake and calm, and eventually I started to fall asleep during the day, and in those days I always woke up with headaches and the feeling my eyes had been pushed into my skull, and I always woke up with pain. Eventually my parents got security cameras because while we were in the city, some people entered the place to go fishing, and there was a shortcut to the neighbouring farm's lake through our forest. This is important because of the next part. So one day, my aunt went to visit. She had some just really weird superstitions and said that the place had gold buried in it for some reason or another, and she went to the forest and saw the mound under the marked tree and talked about it before. She said that it was a good idea to unbury it, and so we did. But that was a really bad idea. I was digging it, and I need to describe what happened now very well to pass the feeling, so bear with me. Now, there's a certain feel of digging dirt that differs from rocks or mud or clay. I learned this that day as I dug that hole. Then, after going through a small layer of fragmented rocks, I hit something soft and resistant that felt like leather. I hit it harder and pushed through it, and immediately after it, there was something hard with a complex and detailed shape. I tried to break through it since my aunt insisted that it was protection for the gold, and my parents were just whipping me into helping her, but it was no use. And it occupied most of the area of the hole, so we couldn't dig around it. It was kind of like the hole was made specifically to bury it or something. My aunt then said that she would cover the hole, but she never did and just went home. And that night was absolute hell. There was no tapping on the window, but there was strong banging instead. The thing kept entering my room non-stop, and even the flashlight wasn't working now. I had to stay awake feeling everything pressuring me, and my door wouldn't close, and this thing would make noise, and this thing would be there just staring at me every time. Now, the part that makes the security cameras important is that they stopped working the moment it all started. There were 4 cameras, one pointing to the front of the house, one pointing to the washroom, one on the back that showed my window, and one pointed to the forest. That morning I went to check the camera footage, and all the cameras had stopped working except for the one pointing to the forest. There was only static for the other 3, but that one just had a small blur on it. And after that night, the thing just never appeared again. I still couldn't sleep because of fear, but it never actually showed up, and things got a lot calmer after that. We moved some time after that, but I always think about it, even now, 4 years later. It was just too real, and there were things that were noticed by other people too. I especially keep thinking about the thing that we hit while digging and how that night was just the worst. And I just keep asking myself if maybe we found a body or some sort of haunted thing that was hidden down there. This happened when I was around 5 or 6 years old, but I remember everything like it happened yesterday. So, we had gone to a funeral of my mum's cousins to another town a couple of hours out, by car. We got to the house and my mum went to see her aunt to give her condolences, and I followed holding her hand. I guess during the hugging and the crying, my mum let go of my hand, so I started looking for her hand, but not really looking up, just keeping my hand out for her to grab it while calling her, and there were a lot of people, and the house was so small that I could only see people standing around me. A couple of minutes later, though, I found her, or so I thought, because she took my hand and started walking towards the door to leave. I thought to myself as I was putting on my shoes, wow, we came such a long drive to be here for only 5 minutes, which led me to look up at the lady holding my hand, and I instantly realized that it wasn't my mum. They had both been wearing black coats at the time, and so I hadn't noticed, but as soon as I did, I said, "Oh, you're not my mum," and snatched my hand back and ran towards the room that I'd lost my mum at. Honestly, at that age, I left it at that and just thought, oh, how funny, I held the wrong lady's hand, while thinking it was my mum. I thought this for almost 2 decades until one day it just kind of hit me. That lady was trying to take me away. She knew that I wasn't her daughter, and she took my hand and was leaving the house with me, and if I hadn't have looked up and had actually made it out the door, who knows what would have happened. It was creepy too, because she never said a word to me from the beginning to the end. And to this day, I still have no idea who that was. So this happened about 5 years ago while I was 9 months pregnant. I was Christmas shopping at the mall with my 7 and 15-year-old daughters one Saturday night in a very safe city with very low crime rates. There was an Applebee's connected to the mall, and we ended our shopping pretty late, and the mall stores were starting to close, so I took my kids to the connected Applebee's for a late dinner. We finish eating at about 10 p.m, I'd say, and leave out the Applebee's entrance into the practically deserted parking lot with shopping bags in tow. As we got to the car, I was in the middle of maneuvering the shopping bags on my arms to find my keys when a 50-ish-year-old crusty-looking guy starts walking up from somewhere in the parking lot with shaggy grey-white hair and a faded flannel shirt and old jeans. I noticed him briskly approaching when he was about 40 feet away, and he said, "This is a stick-up, give me all your money." My blood ran cold, and I stared at him owlishly and shakingly said, "What?" He then said that he was just kidding and came up and stood right next to my daughters, who were standing on the other side of the car waiting for me to unlock the car to let them in. He then starts making small talk with me and my girls, and he asks things like if they were being good girls for Santa, and how old they were, and if we got all our Christmas shopping done, or what kind of things did we get, etc. He didn't seem drunk, high, or slow, or mentally challenged at all. He was very coherent and seemed of sound mind. Mind you, I was a heavily pregnant woman, alone with my 2 daughters in a mostly deserted parking lot at 10 o'clock at night, who was being approached by a stranger who came and stood right next to my kids on the other side of the car, just shooting the breeze, talking to me and my kids with his hands in his pockets and occasionally looking over his shoulder. I didn't want to aggravate him, so I was politely conversing with him and trying to look calm and nonchalant while trying to disguise my frantic hands digging inside my giant purse for my car keys. This exchange went on for a couple of minutes while he periodically kept looking over his shoulder. I was silently panicking and trying to politely keep the situation from escalating by calmly and nonchalantly talking to him while also trying in vain to find my damn car keys to get us out of here. Apparently, they were in there hiding good. I felt like that at any moment he was going to pull a knife or a gun or rob me, and my kids were right next to him, away from their mother and on the other side of the car, and I couldn't find my damn car keys to get my kids into the safety of the car. He kept trying to engage them in conversation, and I could see that my oldest daughter was a little weirded out, and she kept glancing at me to gauge my assessment or reaction to this situation. Kids often tend to not recognize potential danger when they're with their parents since they see us as their protectors, and being that he was only talking and acting friendly, I was doing my best to just stay calm. They were oblivious to the alarming situation that we all were in, and being 9 months pregnant, and that I was no match for this full-grown man, especially if he was hiding a weapon on him. While still desperately digging for my keys, I tried to politely give him hints that the conversation was over by saying things like, "It was nice chatting with you, but I gotta get these kids to bed, and it was nice meeting you," and telling my girls to say that it was nice meeting him too. My polite attempts to get this guy to leave wasn't working because he just kept sidestepping my attempts and asking them what their favorite school subjects are and how nice young ladies they were, etc., while I was struggling with the shopping bags and digging into my giant cluttered purse for my car keys. My outgoing 7-year-old was just completely oblivious to how not okay this situation was, because he was being friendly and because of the whole "I'm with mummy so I'm safe" child mentality. So she started to talk about what she picked out for her daddy for Christmas and started enthusiastically talking about kid stuff and asking him if he knew what Minecraft was and keeping this creep from leaving us alone by keeping him engaged in conversation. They didn't realize that I was becoming desperate to get them the hell out of there at this point, and then suddenly I felt this sinking feeling of dread when I realized that I may have actually lost my keys in the mall, and that we were stuck outside with this strange man who kept looking over his shoulders and was showing no signs of walking away, and I was thinking that he was waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. All he had to do was grab one of my girls and threaten their life, knowing that it would make me do whatever he wanted as long as he wouldn't hurt them. I started to feel my adrenaline start to spike, and my heart and my stomach started doing flip-flops, and I felt like at any moment that it was going to go down as the gravity of realizing that there were no other people or witnesses around, and that we were totally alone with him, and that at that moment the odds were stacked against us, and that he had his chance. Then he all of a sudden was like, "Oh, okay, it was nice talking with you. See you later," and just walked off in the same direction as to which he came. And it wasn't until then that I found my car keys and unlocked the car and told my kids to get in fast, and I got in too and locked the doors and started the car and just drove the hell out of there. My 15-year-old lightheartedly and jokingly said, "Okay, that was weird," and laughed, and I was overwhelmed with relief, and then I was confused over what just happened. I thought to myself, why the hell would a guy of seemingly sound mind think it totally acceptable to go out of his way just to approach a woman and her kids in a deserted parking lot late at night just to chit-chat? But, being that nothing bad happened, I brushed it off and joked about it too. When we got home, my husband greeted us and asked us how shopping went, and I said that it went well, and my 15-year-old told him what happened in the parking lot and how weird it was, and was kind of joking about it. I started joking too, saying how I was mentally having a panic attack while trying to look calm, and I started making fun of myself by telling my husband how I was attempting to inconspicuously rummage through my purse to find my car keys. And at this point, my husband went completely white, and I acknowledged his horrified look of alarm, and I assured him that, albeit creepy, the guy was just talking and eventually just left us on our own. Now, my father-in-law is a retired sheriff deputy, and my husband went through police academy training after graduating high school. He decided to go to business school instead of becoming a cop. And being that the knowledge that he gained from that, plus growing up with a cop for a dad, I found out why my husband looked absolutely horrified when I told him the details. And what my husband told me completely rattled me to the bone. my husband told me that he was 100% sure that the reason why the guy was hanging around us and chit-chatting was because he was waiting for me to unlock my car. And the reason why he was standing next to our kids was because once I unlocked the car and the kids started to get inside, he was most likely going to force himself in the car with the kids and hold a knife or a gun to them to gain leverage on me to force me to cooperate, knowing that I wouldn't abandon my kids, which would force me to get into the car with them and do whatever he wanted me to do, which most likely would be to drive to a remote location to do God knows what. And being that he wasn't wearing a mask, it suggests that his intentions were to also leave no witnesses to identify him. I then remembered that he was positioned by the backseat passenger door where my 7-year-old was standing by, just waiting to get in. My husband then told me that the most likely reason why the guy ended up leaving us was because it took so long for me to find my damn keys, and the longer it took, the more anxious and spooked it made him. And that whole time, I was desperate to find my car keys, which, through some sort of divine intervention, stayed hidden in my purse, thus saving us from potentially being abducted. So, some quick backstory. I work at a gas station on a main route, and we see a lot of travelers passing through. Only one person works each shift, and it's a 24-hour store. We're short-staffed, so I agreed to an overnight. I'm female, and I work in a state that's always had self-serve gas stations. So, this guy comes in, and I asked him if he needed any help, and he says no. He's getting gas at the pump, but needs to use the bathroom. I go back to work on whatever invoices we got yesterday, and the guy uses the bathroom and then goes back outside. About 5 or 7 minutes later, he comes back inside and tells me that he's confused about the pump. He directly says, "You might have to come outside to help me." Customers don't often say this, they usually just complain that it's not working, so I'm already feeling weird about this guy. I shake it off because he looks like a nerd and I don't feel afraid of him really, and I look at the register to see what error it came up with for his pump, and there's no errors. The register doesn't even say it was in use, and even if someone tries to pay and nothing's wrong with their payment, it will at least say payment or loyalty timed out. But literally, it had no sign of him trying to use it before asking me for help. I ask him if he wants to just pay inside, and he agrees to, gets his wallet out of his car, and then pays $10. I give him his receipt, and he says, "Can you help me? I don't understand the machine," and I say, "We aren't really allowed to leave the store during the overnight shifts, as it's just me here, and it's not safe to go outside." I don't know why I told him that I was alone, but he wasn't seemingly threatening. And he proceeds to say, "I don't understand what it's asking me. I need help. I'm not scary." I tell him again that I can't go outside because it's a store policy for the overnight shift, and say, "It's not that you're scary, I just don't go outside." I would have to tell a little old lady asking for help at this hour the same thing, which is true. We can't even take out the trash during overnights. He starts to walk away from the register counter now, but then again stops at the door and asks me one last time to come outside and help him. I'm pretty annoyed at this point, and I've said no twice now, and I'm not going to go, so stop asking. I finally say in a super annoyed tone, "Okay, all you need is to 1. Pick up the nozzle, 2. Select fuel grade button, and 3. Put it into your tank and squeeze the handle. I'm not going outside." Then he finally goes back to his car, and the register tells me that he had no trouble pumping gas. And also, his plates seem like they're not from the state that I work in. Now, this kind of thing wouldn't make me suspicious usually, but the fact that he originally opted for me to go outside instead of bringing money inside at 3 a.m. is weird. Along with how he didn't bother to use the pump before he came inside to ask for help, claiming it wasn't working, and him not taking my first no for an answer, it was all incredibly suspicious. So, I, a 22-year-old female, worked at a mall when I was a young adult. Oftentimes it would be dark by the time that I got to the bus stop, and there were a lot of druggies and creeps around as well. They did bother me some, but they stayed away for the most part. Now, one night, I was walking extra late because of a never-leaving customer, and I saw a truck and a guy talking to a girl that I assumed was in her teens as she looked young. I thought nothing of it. I mean, a lot of teens had to be picked up from the mall as they worked in the food court, sometimes on weekends, got late-night shifts and whatnot, so I thought it was her dad just picking her up. I honestly did. But as I got closer, I could see that she was upset, but I thought that they had had a fight or something. The guy looked up a little angrily at me, and I sat down. I heard him saying to the girl, "Hey honey, you should come with me now, Mum is worried." She backed up slowly, and that's when I looked up, and she was looking at me with a terrified face. This man was clearly drinking as he smelled of liquor, but not stumbling around at this point. And my stomach sank. The bus wasn't going to be there for another half an hour, and I was a small 5-foot woman myself. I started to get this feeling that this guy wasn't her father, and he said, "Come on, honey, get in the truck. Get in the truck now, it's late." I didn't know whether this man was her father or not, but I decided I needed to do something. I said, "Hey, wow, I haven't seen you in a long time," to the girl. I started chatting with her, and she sat down ignoring him, and he was visibly angry and went to the truck that I thought was to leave. The girl sat next to me and explained that the man wasn't her father. She didn't know who he was, but he was trying to get her to go with him. I said okay, just act natural and keep refusing. The guy came back to us with his phone up to his ear and a pipe from what I could tell from his trunk. And he said, "Okay, get in the truck. Your mum's pissed. Lady, you need to mind your own business with a parent and child." I told him that he clearly wasn't her father and he should leave before security cameras captured him doing something illegal. He looked like he just realized that they existed, but decided that he went too far, I guess, already, and walked towards us. He grabbed the girl by her arm and dragged her as she struggled, and I tried to push him off, but he told me not to get between a father and a daughter. I saw a security guard in the window and he mouthed, "Are you okay?" And I mouthed back that I was not and shook my head. He immediately started to unlock the door and grab his phone, I assume calling the police, and the father saw this guy coming and decided finally to leave, swearing and speeding off. The girl was visibly shaken and crying, and her real parents came not too long after the incident, and I left with a few words to the police about my side and giving them my number. I'm glad that I was there because I have not seen the guy since, and I don't know what might have happened to that young girl. I learned that she was only 15, and at one point, he even tried to convince me that I was also his daughter. This happened over the span of around a year when I was 15 and 16. I'm 20 now, and it only recently has been revealed to me just how messed up this situation really was. So, I was obviously still living at home at the time, but my sister, who was 7 years older than me, had moved out and was living with her now husband, their high school best friend, and some other dude that they met via one of those find a roommate sites. He was kind of the reclusive nerdy type, which preferring to hide in his room watching Star Trek and playing computer games than to actually hang out with the roommates. And the only other person he ever really seemed to want to be around was his similarly shy and nerdy girlfriend. For a little context to the story, at the time this happened he was 28 and she was 24. They were both a little weird, but initially seemed entirely harmless. For ease of telling the story and for saving on characters, the friendly roommate will be FR, weird roommate will be WR, and his weird girlfriend will be WGF. Now, my sister and I have never really had the best relationship with our parents, and at this time, things were especially rocky. Our mother was dating a guy who was, to put it kindly, an abusive sack of crap who seemingly loathed me and would find any excuse to go off at me. As a result, I spent a lot of time staying over at my sister's place. It was around the time I'd spent a lot of time there that WR and WGF started to get really strange. As I said earlier, the pair of them were always kind of just odd. They only ever seemed to want to speak to each other and would even go as far to ignore anyone else who spoke to them. WGF was worse than WR for this by a mile. He would at least give you monosyllabic responses most of the time. She had a kind of creepy habit of just blankly staring at you for a couple of seconds and then walking away if you asked her a question or tried to engage her in conversation at all. But that isn't really the weird behavior though. When I would sleep over, I'd sleep on a futon in FR's office space, which was on the ground floor. It happened to be next to the downstairs bathroom, which for some reason WGF vastly preferred to the upstairs one. She would take long showers in the middle of the night, which is whatever. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, and she wasn't a shower singer or anything like that, so I just generally slept right through them. One night, however, I stayed up mega late doing revision and homework and happened to be awake after she finished her shower. I was too absorbed in my task to really pay attention to anything else, but I definitely noted hearing the shower shut off because that was my indicator to how late it really was. Approximately 10 minutes later, I look up from my laptop and there she is. I always kept the door open just a crack because that room tended to get unbearably hot if I didn't, and she was just standing there, outside the room, butt-ass naked, watching me through the open crack in the door. I said her name and asked if she was okay, which seemingly startled her because she walked away pretty sharpish. I convinced myself that in my over-caffeinated, sleep-deprived state I'd imagined the whole thing and didn't mention it to anyone. Fast forward around a month, and I head over to my sister's one night to find FR kind of agitated about what he perceives to be a peeping Tom problem. He found fingerprints on the outside of his office window in such a way that would imply someone had been pressing up against the glass and looking in. The blind in his room was slightly too small for the window, so you could see in from the outside if you looked through at the sides, and the room was on the front of the house and the window was easily accessible from the street. He'd become concerned that some random passing pervert had been spying on him while he was having a private moment, so to speak, in his office, or else some potential burglar had been sizing up the joint. The police were called, but as they didn't have any external CCTV at this point, no evidence could be provided and ultimately not a lot could be done. To combat this escalating further, FR installed both internal and external CCTV on the house. This was installed whilst WR and WGF were away on a holiday, and I guess everyone just forgot to tell them about it. Another couple of months later, and I go to my sister's to find WR's room empty, and informed that he's moved out. Of course, I asked why, and I was informed simply that he and WGF were a pair of creeps, and the others had collectively decided to just kick them out. Apparently, her watching me through the office door was not a one-time incident. The CCTV footage showed that she regularly made a habit of just standing and watching me through the cracked door, sometimes for as long as 20 to 30 minutes. I was usually asleep when she did it. And not only that, but the fingerprints on the window had quite apparently been from WR standing outside and watching me after I'd showered and was hanging out in just a towel, which was a less regular occurrence, but apparently was caught on camera enough times for it to be concerning. And as if this wasn't weird enough in and of itself, I was recently hanging out with my sister and her husband, and he passed comment about how he wishes they'd told me the full story at the time so I could have chosen to press charges. I asked what he meant by that, and he revealed that not only had they been secretly watching me, but the CCTV also showed that they'd messed with food and stuff that I'd bought, including clips of him licking all of my apples, her spitting in my orange juice, even dumping regular cow's milk into my lactose-free stuff, which explained why I had a period of feeling really sick from just nowhere. And to top it all off, apparently when FR barged into their room to confront them about it, he'd not only found that several shirts that I thought I'd misplaced elsewhere had been stolen by the two of them and literally hung up on their wall, but she had done several drawings of me sleeping and written a poem called Ode to My Name, whose contents I don't know, and honestly, I don't really want to know. Apparently, FR gave them an ultimatum of, you have 2 hours to get out of this house and never contact me or any of us again, or I'm calling the police. And they took the former option. They've never tried to contact me subsequent to this, but I honestly feel sick just thinking of what they were potentially planning. So this happened to me around 6 months ago. I have lived where I've lived for 3 years now, and it's a nice apartment in an amazing location, but they were built in the late 90s. The last few years, the city I live in has had a massive population boom, and people have been non-stop pouring in, Good weather, amazing economy, cool place to do stuff always. And because of this, I've seen the landlord's staff start to do heavy maintenance on the apartments to bring them up to date to attract more people to them. My neighbour lived in his apartment for something like 6 years before he ended up buying a house and moved. When he moved, the landlord started immediately redoing his apartment as one to bring it up to date. The way that the apartment layout is that there are 2 stories. Where my bedroom is, on the direct other side of the bedroom wall, is the staircase in my neighbour's apartment. The way my bedroom layout is that it has my bed right up against that wall. So, they were completely stripping this place clean. It was one of the first ones that they did such heavy remodeling to, and for weeks I would always see the workers over there painting and redoing the floors, etc. A few days before this happened, it was no different. I left and saw them doing their maintenance on the kitchen, and when I came home from work, they were gone for the day. Nothing unusual. But the part that is unusual is what happened one particular night. So I was awake around 1 a.m. just watching TV in my room when I heard someone on the other side of the wall slowly walking up the stairs, and very obviously stopping halfway up. Where the person was stopping was directly where my head laid on the other side of the wall, and I could feel him listening to me breathing. I immediately turned the TV sound off and sat there extremely quiet and still. I heard nothing for a few minutes, and then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the person start walking the rest of the stairs to the 2nd floor. My survival instinct kicked in instantly. It was very obvious that someone was on the other side of that wall listening to me. I also knew that it was only a few days before this happened that I saw the maintenance redoing that apartment's kitchen. I knew that there was no way that someone already moved in that fast. I quietly got out of bed and went to a room where I had a better view of the outside of the apartment. I obviously couldn't see if there was movement in there from the window, but I had a good angle to see if anyone walked out. So I sat there for about 15 minutes just staring outside to see if I saw anything at all, and nothing. I went back into my room and I laid down in bed again. I didn't play the TV this time though, I just kind of sat there waiting to hear something again. I was messing around on my phone for about 20 minutes in silence until I heard movement in the stairs again. This time, though, the movement didn't start from the top or the bottom. The movement started in the middle of the staircase, meaning that the entire time that I was sitting there in silence, this person was just on the other side of the wall listening to my every move. This terrified me, so I called the cops at this point. I gave them all the information of what was going on, and they informed me that someone would be out very soon. I went back to the one room and watched out the window again. Only a few moments later, a police car pulled up and a cop got out to examine the building and the apartment. He was looking around and shining his light in the windows, and I heard him knock on the door and shortly after could hear him talking to someone, but couldn't make out what they were saying. I was totally puzzled by this, and the officer walked over to my door and knocked. I went downstairs and he informed me very nicely that someone just moved in there. I laughed and I was completely embarrassed. I even said to the cop that it was a hell of a way to meet your new neighbor. I felt embarrassed, but more importantly, very relieved about the entire situation. So I brushed off the whole thing as it just being late and my mind playing massive tricks on me. The next day I went to leave my apartment when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. I went outside and only took a few steps towards my car when I saw a maintenance over there carrying out the old refrigerator. I was puzzled at this point, so I walked over to the apartment and I looked into the door that was wide open. The kitchen was still being worked on, and not a single piece of furniture could be seen. I was legitimately speechless, and I walked over to the maintenance man and said, "Did someone move in here?" And he informed me that no, and that the apartment wouldn't be ready for showings until at least 3 weeks. At this point, I ran back upstairs into my apartment and I called my landlord. I asked her if someone is staying there, and she said absolutely not. I told her about what I experienced the night before, and she was floored. She told me that they would change that apartment's lock immediately, and she also suggested that I call the non-emergency line to the police department and inform them that no one lives there. I did just that, and they asked me to come down to the station, and I told them all of the information in detail about what happened. They were able to quickly figure out what officer came out to check out the situation so he could help identify the person who answered the door. The officer described the man in detail, and I confirmed that I had never seen him around the apartments before. But there was a search around town for a few weeks until the whole thing just sort of fizzled out, and I stopped hearing about it and started seeing less and less patrol cars randomly in the parking lot. After that night, I never heard another thing in that apartment as well. Around a month later, an older couple moved in and they were really nice. But when I saw the moving van pull up, I went out to introduce myself to them, but to be completely honest, the only reason I went out there was to see if any of them matched the description of who the cops saw. And it wasn't even close. I'm certain now that the person who was in the apartment, they got away with it. I had an extremely hard time sleeping the following weeks after that happened to me, and I actually ended up moving my bed into the smaller second bedroom because it bothered me so much. I have zero idea of what the intentions of the person was or what he was doing in that staircase, but it's easily one of the most chilling things that's ever happened to me. It's always creepy when someone you've known forever and have thought of like a mentor is revealed to just be something much, much different. So, I had this boss who I'll call Mike, and he had come to fill in for a few months while my regular boss was on maternity leave. He was pretty amazing, and he inspired me to work harder and even ended up promoting me. The two of us and a third employee, I'll call James, were always working shifts together. It was fun, just laughing and kicking ass because we all had a similar sense of humor, and James and I were definitely the best employees there. After Mike's time to fill in was over, James and I were super bummed about it because he was seriously the best manager that we'd ever had. He was fair and rewarded hard work and truly cared about his employee satisfaction. Plus, he just made everything fun, even though we were working really hard. We both looked up to Mike as a manager and also just as a human being. We had the utmost respect for him, and we vowed to keep in touch when we parted ways. Well, fast forward a year or so, and James and I ended up dating. We kept in touch with Mike, and he was so happy that we ended up together because he thought that we were both great people who deserved each other. We saw Mike a few more times and kept in touch over the years through social media. When James proposed and we started planning our wedding, we knew we wanted Mike to be in it. He was part of our trio back before James and I even knew that we would be together, and the three of us had a really strong bond. So we asked him if he would be okay with reading something during the ceremony, and he accepted, expressing how honored he felt. Well, when it got to the day of the wedding, Mike was nowhere to be seen. We kept calling him as the ceremony was quickly approaching, and finally James got a hold of him. Mike told him that he couldn't get out of work and wouldn't be able to make it. We were both taken aback a little because the Mike that we knew and looked up to would never bail like this and not even let us know. We figured that there had to be some sort of reasonable explanation, but were pretty disappointed, but the wedding had to go on. We had James's niece to do the reading, even though Mike's name was printed in the program, and, well, fast forward again a few more years. We had only spoken to Mike a handful of times since the wedding, but he had also taken the time to write me a beautiful, lengthy recommendation letter in that time period. There were no hard feelings about the wedding, and James and I still shared the highest of opinions of our friend. Then, Mike just kind of disappeared off of all social media, and the next time we tried calling him, his phone number had changed. James and I exchanged sentiments of concern and hoped that he was doing okay, but I didn't go much past that. One day, James got a random call from a number that wasn't in his contact list. He answered it, and it turned out to be Mike, so he put him on speakerphone so I could say hello too. We had our brief pleasantries, but then Mike got into the reason for his call. He wanted to know if he could stay with us for a day or two. My initial reaction was, of course, but James shot me a sharp look, so I added, well, let us discuss it and we'll call you back. Before concluding the call, James inquired about what was going on. Mike said that he'd been living with his father to take care of him because he was terminally ill, but that he couldn't stay there another night because he checked the camera footage in their home and seen his dad on the tape standing over him with a knife while he slept. When the call was ended, James said that he thought something was off. I didn't really get why he'd instantly be that suspicious. I mean, the story was insane and all, but it was Mike. James said something like, We haven't heard from him in forever, and now he's calling us for a favor. He lives 2 hours away, and we're the ones he calls. Why wouldn't he seek the help of someone closer? I mean, he has family in the area too." I agreed that it was odd, and it definitely conjured up a lot of questions, including why there were even cameras inside of their house in the first place, but I still didn't like the idea of leaving Mike hanging if he truly was out of options. I told James that we should call back and probe a little more. When we called back, James asked if it wouldn't be easier to have someone closer to help him out, and asked about family in the area. Mike gave a vague explanation of why everyone in his life had turned against him. Then, with the most mopey, disappointed voice, he said it was okay if we couldn't help, that he understood what was going on and wouldn't bother us anymore. And James and I looked at each other and said, "We'll call him right back." We quickly discussed that this was all very strange, but that he had to be pretty desperate to contact us for help. We acknowledged that his little bit about understanding if we were unable to help was meant to manipulate us, and we felt conflicted about everything, but ultimately decided a few days couldn't hurt. We called him back, told him that he could come, and figured that we give him the address and that would be that. But he said that he no longer had a vehicle and would need to be picked up. We asked about catching an Uber, and he said that he had no money that he could access at that moment, which we didn't pry him on. It was getting late, and it was a long drive to his location, so we asked if he had anywhere to stay for that night, and we could try the trip in the morning. He said that he'd just sleep on a park bench or something, which, again, we knew was meant to manipulate us, but we didn't cave in on that one. We asked where we should pick him up the following day, and he gave us his dad's address. Immediately after we got off the phone, we were like, what the heck has been going on with Mike that has ostracized him from all his friends and family and caused him to lose his car? He had been making 4 times our salary when we all first met and had a brand new car, and now he didn't even have money for an Uber? Well, we went and picked him up the next day, and I got out and ran up and gave him a hug. He seemed oddly unresponsive to my affections, so I just shrugged it off and showed him to the front passenger seat where I'd been sitting. He was super tall, so I let him sit up there and I hopped in the back. When we got back to our house, we showed him our guest room and put his things down, and then immediately asked if we could take him to the grocery store. James said that he was done driving for the day, so I said I'd take him, but commented that I thought that he didn't have money on him. He told me that he had food stamps, which there's no way that he would have qualified for with his old job. So at this point, I knew something was up, but I wasn't going to dig into the personal details of his finances, so I just logged it into the back of my mind and kept my mouth shut. You might be thinking that it just sounds like someone who's fell on hard times, and that was basically Mike's story as well, but it was just very vague in important areas and full of story after story about people that seemed determined to destroy him for no reason whatsoever. Well, 1 or 2 bad eggs is believable, I suppose, but no one is the innocent victim in every scenario, right? He was telling us that he had no idea why his life had fallen apart and why those close to him seemed to just turn on him out of nowhere, or why so many people were out to get him without seeming having any motivation. And well, 2 nights turned into a full week, and finally James asked Mike what his plan was. Mike acted hurt and said that he'd be gone by the morning, and we told him that he didn't need to leave immediately, but we'd like to have some kind of idea of his plan for going forward. That night in bed, James and I discussed it and decided that we'd tell Mike that he could stay for as long as he needed if he wanted to help out around the house and keep his room relatively clean, because it contained several antique items of James's mother's. We also were going to ask him to help me with some entrepreneurial decisions, as Mike had claimed to have been a totally self-made successful entrepreneur before this. We presented our offer the next day, and Mike excitedly accepted. We thought that it was going to be a rewarding trade-off for all parties, in fact. Now, this isn't a story about my marriage, so I'm not going to go too far into the wealth of the problems James and I had, but a little info will be necessary. So James was highly critical of me and often talked down to me and seemed to have nothing but negative opinions. I wasn't perfect, I admit, but I wanted to be loved and worked my ass off for James's approval. I was constantly trying to make him happy, but no matter what I did, I would always fail in his eyes. So, after a few weeks, Mike clearly started to see the cracks in the marriage, despite the fact that James toned it down in Mike's presence. Trying to be a good wife, I acted like all was fine in front of Mike and never mentioned any dissatisfaction in my marriage. Mike and I started to spend a lot of time alone in our entrepreneurial pursuits, and he was supposed to be teaching me the tricks of the trade with several avenues of making money, but we just kept coming out with little success. He had excuses and explanations for why this wisdom didn't seem to be progressing us forward at all, but he was someone that I greatly looked up to as a professional and a friend, so I just believed that it would all pay off soon, like he said. After living together for weeks, enough talking among all of us had been done to start noticing weird contradictions to many of the things Mike had told us, but he always worded things in a way that left a slight amount of room for doubt, so that if you were to question any of it, there was wiggle room. There was never a way to straight up catch him in a lie, is what I'm getting at. Mike also wasn't fulfilling his end of our deal at home and kept saying that he'd take his turn to do the dishes and such, but I probably only did it once or twice, I'd say, and he completely trashed the guest room. And not only was there garbage everywhere, but he'd bring in food and drinks, and they'd be lost in this sea of clothes and trash, and we could smell things rotting in there. But there was a melted tub of ice cream just sitting on the bedside table for weeks, and I didn't care as much as James did, and I suggested that we just remove his mum's things from the room, but I did agree that it was disrespectful. Meanwhile, things were getting more and more icy with James and I, and one day when I was out with Mike on a job, I broke down in tears about how much I was hurting about how James treated me. Mike offered words of comfort and reluctantly admitted that he'd picked up on how mean James could be to me and said that he was really sorry and that I didn't deserve it. Mike, having been possibly the only witness that I ever had to what I'd been going through in my marriage, he was amazingly validating. Mike agreed that it was incredibly unjustified, but made me promise not to tell James that he'd said anything because he didn't want to appear like he was taking sides. The next day, Mike had once again volunteered to take a turn doing the dishes, so I didn't do them. I hated doing dishes and happily left them for Mike when he assured me that he'd handle it. Well, Mike got a call informing him that his dad didn't have long to live, so he wanted to go see him. James didn't seem all that interested in helping, so I volunteered to take him and stay for moral support, and we headed out. On the way to see his dad, Mike started to tell me that his dad has dementia and makes up weird things, so he advised me not to take anything to heart. He cited a few examples of things that he'd previously said, and they were all more like accusations. One of them being that Mike had stolen all the money in his savings, which I thought was pretty odd, but couldn't really reconcile the vast differences between the Mike that I'd met 8 years before and someone who could rob his dying father. While we were visiting his dad, I didn't say much as I didn't want to insert myself into a private family moment, but I kept noticing things that were just weird. Like that his dad was fully conscious and talkative and didn't seem like a dying man at all. He even asked him to get him some Burger King in the middle of it all. I kept trying to justify things in my head, like, who am I to say a dying man can't want a final meal at a Burger King? A few hours in, and James called, irate that I had left again without doing the dishes that Mike promised to do. He chewed me out and threatened divorce, which was always his go-to to try to whip me into shape, and having the recent affirmation from Mike that I wasn't the only one who saw James' emotional abuse, I said, fine, divorce won't be thrown in my face anymore, so divorce it is. Back in Mike's dad's room, his dad was yelling about his will and money and such, and Mike looked at me in a way to signal that the dementia was talking. I had started to really question what happened with his dad and if he was really even dying at all, but it wasn't something that I could really handle or investigate at that moment, given that I'd just separated from my husband. When we left the hospital, Mike's dad was still alive and, in fact, eating candy bars. I had nowhere else to go, so I went back home and just slept upstairs on the couch. I didn't speak to James for 2 whole days, and then Mike said that he'd talk to his mum and I could stay there for a week. I wondered at that moment why his mum wasn't the one helping him if they were in contact and on good terms, but I just accepted the offer. I couldn't take being at that house anymore, and Mike said that he was going to go with me and stay there too, which I thought looked really bad, but he said that he spoke to James and that he understood and was fine with it. I spent the entire week crying and talking to Mike about how I felt, and he even woke up in the middle of the night with me if I woke up, and things started spiraling downhill quickly. He made no advances on me or anything of the sort, but it was definitely weird. After the week, I went to stay with my parents, and Mike went back to stay with James, and I eventually saw them both when I'd come over to get things, and in talking with James, he was very much ready for Mike to leave. They barely seemed to talk, in fact, and did not seem on good terms whatsoever. And then, one night, I just got the weirdest impulse to ask James if Mike ever said anything about me that he made him promise not to tell me. James hesitated for a second, but said yes. And through a series of questions, we inched through both of our experiences with Mike. And he had been playing into our rapidly declining marriage and was using everything he observed against us. He'd been going out and teaching me things to make money, and he did the same thing he did as my boss all those years before, told me my strengths and complimented my ability to catch on to things quickly. We didn't have much success, but it was very obviously not on account of me. However, he was going back and feeding into James's terrible opinion of me and claiming that we weren't making any money because I was so dense and hard to teach. Mike would also comment on the very same things that he told me were unacceptable that James did, except he'd tell James that he doesn't know how he lives with someone like me and that he'd go insane. In other words, this guy was carefully and strategically forcing our marriage to fall apart by exacerbating our personal fears and insecurities and systematically validating and encouraging our resentment for one another. And he did it in such a way that neither of us doubted his sincerity for a moment, until I finally just got a weird feeling and decided to ask that night. And even then, I didn't really anticipate finding out that he'd been so two-faced and manipulative to that extreme level. James kicked him out that night, and neither of us have talked to him again since, as far as I know anyway. I haven't spoken to James in 1.5 years, and I proceeded with the divorce despite this because even though Mike was an insincere piece of crap, he caused me to get enough distance from James that I was able to see that I deserved a lot better. Last I heard about Mike was from his mum, who called me to see why he'd been asked to abruptly leave James's house. I told her what he'd done, and she didn't seem surprised. I asked if she was aware of any mental problems that he may have had, and she said that she didn't want to betray her son by giving details, but that he wasn't right in the head. I asked about several of the traumatic events Mike had claimed to be the victim of, and she said that there's never been evidence that any of it really happened. I don't know why he actively initiated the final downfall of my marriage, because I've never felt it was an attempt to be with me or anything. I really don't get what his motivation or game would have been. And then, Mike's mum texted me a few days after he left James's house to tell me that he'd apparently been admitted into a psychiatric facility and wouldn't be out for a long time. And she wouldn't elaborate. I was just commenting somewhere else about how a teacher in one of my high schools was arrested for placing nipple clamps on a male student. I tried to look up the article and found out that upwards of 6 to 7 teachers, male and female, during my time there had been arrested for all sorts of abuse. Most after I graduated though, but one in particular made me just shake my head. So I had a woodshop teacher that went out of his way to be the cool guy. He would let us pretty much do anything in class and would even let us go out of the side door and smoke if we wanted, and he would also come up to us guys and make really sexual comments about female students. One time I remember him coming over to me and some other dudes with an open can of shellac, it's white and sticky, and saying, "Hey fellas, you know you got yourself a good whore when she takes a load like this." He then laughed and looked at a really attractive girl in class and said, "Bet she does." We all kind of just nervously chuckled and let out a big "what the F" after he walked away. Years after I graduated, I actually worked with him for a short time, and he was still creepy as ever. And I just found an article saying that he was arrested last year for inappropriately touching 3 female students and providing male students with drugs and alcohol. Other gems from this school include the aforementioned nipple clamp story, a female teacher abusing two male students, and pretty much the whole coaching staff for football being removed for allowing players to sexually abuse other players, and hazing rituals. And the really sick part with the last one is that the parents of the community were enraged at the victims of the abuse and the school for removing the coaches and punishing the players. Why? Because the school was winning a ton of championships, and these scumbag parents thought that that was more important than the safety of their own children. What the hell is going on in this school? This story actually happened back when I was 18 years old and lived on my own. I came from a small town of around 1,000 people and moved to the city about 2 hours away for college. I wasn't naive due to my upbringing, but still very new to the whole "my neighbours are on the other side of the wall, not 2 miles away" thing. I'm around 5'3", a bigger girl, but at the time of this story I was more in shape and on the curvier side of being chubby, so I caught some unwanted attention. Now, my apartment was on the bad side of town. The road it was next to had some motels notorious for housing dealers and streetwalkers, addicts, etc., and a gas station that had to close at 9 p.m. because it just got robbed so much. My building was set up so that every time someone walked by it on the road, you could see into the first 2 apartment windows if the blinds were open. I lived in apartment number 2. Even though I lived on my own, my cousin was in the military at the time and would have to come into the city one weekend out of the month for drills and such. Him and his buddies decided that staying at my place during those weekends was cheaper than a hotel, and it was pretty laid back, so it became a normal thing for me to have 4 or 5 army dudes crashing on my living room floor. And these guys staying with me is the thing that saved my butt one night. So one night, all the guys had gone out to a party at a buddy's house except for my cousin. They left their cars at the complex, and my cuz was going to just pick them all up in the morning. Him and I stayed up and just talked pretty late into the night, and I headed upstairs for bed around 1 o'clock in the morning. But about an hour later, there was a knock on my front door. I thought that maybe my cousin had locked himself out or something after he went to go and get a tobacco fix, so I went back downstairs, only to see him sitting upright on the couch, staring at my front door. My front door is at the foot of my stairs, so I just about jumped out of my skin when another round of knocks landing in the door, louder this time, began. My cousin got up from the couch, and we just stood in the darkness, listening. Nothing happened for a minute, and I started to think that it was just one of my neighbour's friends who had had a few too many, and mixed up our apartments or something, but then another small knock came, followed by, "Hey, my car broke down up the road. I was wondering if I could get some help." It was a male's voice, but he didn't sound creepy, but there was something about the situation that just felt off. Neither me or my cousin moved from where we were standing in the living room, and he whispered not to say anything, and I just nodded. We heard the man say, "Come on, I just need a ride to my friend's house. It's not that far away." And we still said nothing. And then he said hello and another knock. At this point, my cousin had grabbed a baseball bat out of one of the other guy's duffel bags, and it was something the guy kept on him since it was cheaper than a gun. He walked over to the window and was about to peek out the blinds. I didn't have a peephole, when the guy outside knocked really hard. He slams on the door and says, "Hey, I'm talking to you, girl." And my blood went cold at this point. How the hell did he know a girl lived there? He tried the doorknob, locked obviously, before slamming into the door again. This time he screamed, "I just need some help with my car, be a good girl and come and help me out here." My cousin stepped forward quickly to open the door, super mad at this point, and I stopped him. The guy slammed on the door one more time before I heard a scraping weird noise. I quickly realized that it was the sound of him sliding down the door to sit in front of it. My cousin peeked out the blinds and just watches the guy sit there, head down in the darkness and not doing anything. I didn't want to go upstairs to get my phone because, well, sometimes my stairs squeaked really loudly and I didn't want the guy to hear movement inside. My cousin's phone was dead, so calling the cops was out until it charged enough to turn on anyway. About 10 minutes later, and the dude was stood up and knocked again. And this time, my cousin threw open the door quickly and yelled, "It's 2 a.m, what do you want?" and the guy, he just froze. My cousin isn't a tall guy or anything, but for someone expecting a young woman, seeing an angry, muscular, shirtless dude in army pants holding a baseball bat, it was probably somewhat intimidating at least. It was probably somewhat intimidating. But they stared at each other for a second. I was out of eyesight from the door and could only see my cousin, not the man, and they didn't say anything. My cousin eventually broke the silence, though, and said, "Well, what do you need, man?" The dude answered in a quiet voice, muttering something about having the wrong apartment and that he was sorry to disturb him before just turning away quickly and walking out of the complex driveway, up the road and just out of sight. I'm really glad that my cousin stayed at my place instead of going out that night, and I have no other explanation for how the guy knew that I was female, besides that he had seen me walk in and out of my place before and had planned this or something. We didn't call the cops because, well, it was too dark to see the guy's face under the hat that he was wearing, and we couldn't really give a good description. And I never got another knock at my door again for the next year or so that I lived there. Okay, so first off, I know a lot of people will think that this is a hoax because, well, it's in Scotland, but I don't know how else to explain this. I'm extremely familiar with Wendigos and skinwalkers, fleshgates, all that stuff, and there's probably not a Native American possibility that I'm unaware of, but the only explanation to me is a skinwalker. I apologize for my use of Scots slang in advance. So, I'm a teenager, but won't disclose my age, and I go to a public school in Perthshire, Scotland. It's mostly a rural area with mostly towns, villages, and just houses dotting the landscape, although there are 2 major cities in my area. The high school that I go to is in an average-sized town, and for privacy reasons, I'll not disclose its name. Not many people have had many paranormal encounters here, although a few people claim to have seen ghosts and whatnot. But anyways, on to my encounter. So I live in a pretty large house in the middle of a field with my family. It's not too far from the town that I go to school in, but I usually take the bus in because, well, I'm a lazy git. Sometimes me and my mates, E, J, and C, take a path through a nearby forest to come back to my place, where we just play video games and all that sort of stuff. But this particular night, my parents were out of town, and we decided to drink a bit of booze that we had in the mini-fridge in my room. I didn't try much, I'm not much of a drinker, and beer's not really my thing anyway, or C's really. E and J, however, they went all out. It got really late, or rather early, and they decided to leave and head home at this point. I said bye to them and headed back up to my room to play some more video games, and about half an hour later I heard a loud banging on my door. It was J and E, and I let them in, and they started panicking. C goes home a different way to them, and he lives a bit closer to me than the others. E and J said that they were walking through the woods and they saw a tall, skinny-looking bloke pelting it towards them. They panicked and legged it back to my house while the skinny fella just gave chase. But my mind went back to another friend, somewhat of a paranormal buff, who told me about Wendigos and skinwalkers. I called 999 though and said that a prowler was lurking around our house and had chased my mates back to my house, given that that was the most likely explanation. I gave the operator my address and they said that they'd have a car or two to my house in about an hour and a half or so, because apparently there was a big traffic incident or something. In the meantime, he said, arm yourselves, lock all the doors and windows and lock yourself in a room. We did that, grabbing knives from the kitchen and barricading ourselves inside my bedroom, and after a while we heard heavy footsteps around our house. And thinking it was the police, I peered out the window, and what I saw, I will never forget. It was E. It looked exactly the same as her, and I knew that she was sitting crying in my room. I freaked out, and it saw me, and then it said something like, "What the hell is that thing?" but in a really broken way, and whatever the heck it was outside, it could speak, and it sounded exactly like Jay, though. It looked like one of my friends, but sounded like the other, and it must have been confused, and that made it even scarier. We heard sirens not too long after, and it just ran off into the woods. We told the police officers everything, and they checked it out, and The officers eventually left after saying the woods were cleared, and then muttered something about prank callers, and after they left, we heard this inhumane shriek, but it was also sort of human-like. It was really weird, and it was definitely in the distance. We didn't sleep at all that night, but I believe that what we saw was definitely some sort of skinwalker or something like it. I hope to God Almighty that I never have to see anything like that again, but if I do, I'll be sure to make a follow-up. My mum and dad split up when I was about 2. My dad eventually ended up with his current wife, and they moved quite far away. Me and my older brother, B, would go up and see him once a month. When we first moved away, he lived in this really big house that was just set out really oddly. You'd enter the house into a tiny hall with the front room on the right and a dining room to the left, and you'd walk through the dining room to the kitchen, which had the back door to the garden, as well as having the bathroom and the toilet attached to the kitchen. It was super weird. Upstairs was my dad's bedroom to the right, above the front room, and to the left was a really long hallway. About halfway down the hallway was my brother's room, to the left if you were just walking down the hall, and at the end you came face to face with the door to my room. So, the story goes that the place was haunted. I was reasonably young, say about 11 or 12 I think. They didn't want to tell me about it because they thought I'd be scared, which I understand. But I found out later of the things that happened to them whilst in the home. So, Sam, the lady that my dad married, had an incident where she was in her bedroom doing her hair in the mirror. She looked up in the mirror and saw a young girl standing behind her with her arms crossed over her chest. Sam squealed, closed her eyes, and put her head in her hands, and when she looked back up, the girl was gone. There were plenty of other instances of doors opening and closing, and footsteps up and down the long hall, and knocking about in the attic, as well as the dogs acting weird. He had 2 huge Rottweilers, but one day, I was staying the weekend, and I felt really sick. My family had made plans to go out, but I didn't feel up to it. So they decided to leave me at home on my dad's PC in the care of the dogs. They didn't want to let me be alone in case something happened. Now, whilst I was playing on the PC, the dogs just got really weird. They were normally quite docile, really friendly, and extremely loving, and, well, they started running about the front room just barking. Every once in a while, they would stop and just aggressively growl at the fireplace. I stopped and tried to calm them down, but as I knelt next to one of them, it turned and bit me on the face. He was immediately apologetic, licking and whimpering whilst asking for cuddles, but I was honestly scared and it hurt a bit. He didn't ever break the skin, so it wasn't a bad bite or anything, but it felt like I was going to throw up, and I ran to the bathroom and the family got home, and I told them what happened, and they looked really concerned, but told me not to worry about it and keep an eye on us. So, a little something about my room too. It was dark and really small, and it had a tiny window, as well as 2 huge wardrobes in the corners. I never really felt comfy in that room, and I hated being able to see the bedroom door, and I have no idea why, to be honest. I'd often read in bed and then try and sleep on the floor, which is really odd now that I think about it. I just couldn't get comfy in that bed though, and always felt really unsafe there. Anyways, later that night we all went to bed, and I like to read before going to sleep, so I was reading to myself and slowly drifting off to sleep when the bedroom just started screaming. I know that sounds weird, but there was just this insanely loud scream coming from the room. I had no idea what was going on, so I immediately panicked. I mean, who wouldn't? I tried to open my door and it just wouldn't budge. I could hear my brother on the other side of the door also trying to open it, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. The screaming was that loud that I couldn't hear anything. The screaming was just too loud. I heard thumps outside the door, and I had no clue what was happening and just kept trying to open the door whilst crying now. And suddenly, the screaming just stopped, and the door opened. My brother, Dad, and Sam were just standing there staring at me, and I was sobbing, and my brother hugged me, and my dad asked why I was screaming and whether I saw the girl. I obviously said that I wasn't the one screaming, and my brother confirmed that he could hear me saying "what" through the screaming, and I stayed in my brother's room that night. The next time I went to my dad's, he had moved homes, and I heard the other stories years later. I'd heard other stories about the fireplace being pulled out and things being found there, but to be honest, they sounded a little bit far-fetched to me. I know the above sounds the same, but let me assure you that it did actually happen. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you would like to help me out, then please go ahead and watch another video by clicking on a card on the screen. As always guys, thanks for all the love and support, and I'll see you mates in the next one.